Sometimes the man you're meant to marry arrives in chains, and the life you thought you'd chosen reveals itself as something far darker than any letter could confess. In 1887, a woman traveled 2,000 miles to meet her future husband, only to find him bound and accused of a crime that could steal everything she'd dared to hope for. What she discovered in those first terrifying moments would test not just her courage, but her ability to see truth when everyone else saw only guilt. This is the story of a promise made in ink and a love forged in the shadow of judgment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain fell in sheets against the windows of the Whitmore house on Beacon Hill, turning the cobblestone streets below into dark rivers that reflected the gas lamps like scattered coins. Catherine Whitmore stood in the library, her fingers tracing the spine of a leather-bound volume she'd read 3 times already, listening to the sounds of her brother's engagement party drifting from the parlor below. Laughter rose and fell in practiced waves. Champagne glasses clinked with the precision of a well-rehearsed orchestra, and her mother's voice carried above it all, musical and commanding, orchestrating the evening like she orchestrated everything else in their lives. Catherine was 28 years old, unmarried in a world where that fact alone defined her more than any accomplishment ever could. She had spent her 20s watching friends marry and disappear into households where their opinions mattered less than the china patterns they selected. Her mother had presented her to Boston society with the determination of a general mounting a campaign, but Catherine had committed the unforgivable sin of being interesting. She asked questions at dinner parties that made men uncomfortable. She'd read philosophy and science, could discuss political theory, and had opinions about the labor movements sweeping through the northern cities. One by one, potential suitors had retreated, and her mother's disappointment had hardened into something cold and permanent. The worst part wasn't the judgment or the pitying looks from women who had settled into marriages of convenience and convinced themselves they were content. The worst part was the creeping certainty that she was disappearing, that each year she remained in this house. She became less herself and more the thing her mother needed her to be, quiet, ornamental, grateful for whatever scraps of life she was permitted. Her younger brother had the freedom to choose his path, to attend university, to make mistakes, and have them called character building. Catherine's mistakes were simply failures, proof that she'd aimed too high and deserved the loneliness that followed. She pulled the book from the shelf without really seeing it, needing something to occupy her hands, some excuse to remain hidden in the library while the party continued without her. Her mother had stopped insisting she attend these gatherings months ago, and Catherine wasn't sure if that represented freedom or defeat. The door opened behind her, and she turned to find her younger sister Rebecca slipping inside. Her face flushed from dancing, her eyes bright with the kind of hope Catherine remembered feeling once. "A long time ago. You're hiding again," Rebecca said. But there was no accusation in it, only understanding. At 19, Rebecca was everything Catherine had been expected to be: charming, compliant, content to let others shape her future. But she loved her older sister with a fierceness that sometimes surprised them both. "Mother's going to notice eventually." Catherine set the book down, managing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Let her notice. I'm hardly the evening's main attraction." Rebecca crossed the room and took her sister's hands, and Catherine was struck by how much had changed, how her little sister now looked at her with something close to pity. "You can't keep living like this. You're wasting away in this house, and everyone can see it except you." The words stung because they were true. Catherine pulled her hands free and moved to the window, watching rain blur the world outside into something soft and indistinct. "And what would you have me do?" "Accept the next man who shows even passing interest, regardless of whether we have anything in common beyond breathing the same air. Marry for security, and spend the rest of my life pretending I'm fulfilled arranging flowers and hosting dinners where I'm expected to smile and stay silent. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper. I wasn't going to show you this. I thought it might be cruel. But then I realized that maybe cruel is exactly what you need right now. Catherine took the paper, recognizing it as one of those Western publications that her brother sometimes brought home, full of advertisements for land and opportunity in territories that still felt mythical to proper Bostonians. Rebecca had folded it open to a section near the back, and Catherine's eyes found the listing her sister had marked. Seeking a woman of intelligence and courage to join me in building a life in Blackwater, Wyoming. Must value honesty above comfort and be willing to see a man's character rather than his circumstances. Daniel Merrick. The words were spare, almost blunt, but something in them made Catherine's pulse quicken. Intelligence, courage, character rather than circumstances. These weren't the words of a man looking for decoration or someone to manage his household. These were the words of someone who wanted a partner. You're not actually considering this, Rebecca said, watching her sister's face. These men could be anyone, criminals, drunkards, men who can't find wives in their own towns for good reason. Catherine read the advertisement again, slower this time, paying attention to what wasn't said as much as what was. The phrasing was educated, thoughtful. The location was specific enough to verify. And there was something in that phrase, see a man's character rather than his circumstances, that suggested complexity, perhaps difficulty, but also honesty about it. What do I have here? Catherine asked quietly. Another 10 years of watching life happen around me while I fade into furniture. Mother's given up on me marrying well. Soon she'll give up on me marrying at all. And then I'll become that useful spinster aunt who helps raise other people's children and is grateful for the charity of being included. Rebecca's expression crumpled. You could be happy here. You could find someone eventually, but they both knew that wasn't true. Catherine had made herself unmarriageable in Boston society by being exactly who she was, and changing now would only mean a different kind of death, slower and more complete. She folded the newspaper carefully and slipped it into her pocket. I'm not deciding anything tonight, but I'm going to write to him, just to see. Her sister grabbed her arm, suddenly fierce. And if he writes back? If he wants you to come? You'd really leave everything, everyone, for a complete stranger in a place you've never seen. Catherine met her eyes, and for the first time in months, she felt something other than resignation. I'd leave everything to become someone again, to find out who I could be if no one was telling me who I should be. That night, after the party had finally ended and the house fell into the heavy silence of satisfied exhaustion, Catherine sat at her writing desk by candlelight and composed her letter. She didn't soften herself or lie about her education or her opinions. She wrote about the suffocation of expectations, about wanting a life where her mind mattered as much as her ability to pour tea correctly, about being willing to work hard if that work meant something beyond maintaining appearances. She wrote about her father, who died when she was 16, a doctor who taught her to think critically and question assumptions. She wrote about the loneliness of being different in a world that rewarded sameness. And then, before she could second-guess herself into paralysis, she sealed the envelope and addressed it to Daniel Merrick, Blackwater, Wyoming Territory. The next morning, she walked through the early fog to the post office and sent the letter west. For weeks afterward, she moved through her days in a strange state of suspension, half present in her life, while the other half wondered what response might be traveling back toward her. Her mother noticed the distraction and attributed it to melancholy, prescribing more social engagements as if other people's happiness might be contagious. Catherine attended dutifully, smiled when required, and felt nothing except the ticking awareness of time passing. 6 weeks after she'd sent her letter, a reply arrived. The envelope was thick, the paper rough compared to the fine stationery she was accustomed to. And when she opened it in the privacy of her room, 3 pages fell out, covered in a strong, clear hand. Daniel Merrick wrote like a man who'd learned to use words carefully. who understood their weight and chose them accordingly. He told her about Wyoming's brutal honesty, how the land didn't care about pretense or pedigree, how people were measured by their actions rather than their ancestry. He told her about building a ranch from nothing, about neighbors who helped each other survive winters that could kill the careless or unlucky. And then, in the second page, he told her something that most men would have hidden until it was too late to matter. "I need to be honest with you about my circumstances," he wrote. "I've had trouble here, conflicts over land and water rights with a powerful neighbor who doesn't believe in sharing resources. I've been accused of things I didn't do, and there are people in this town who see me as dangerous rather than determined. If you come here, you'll be walking into a situation that's complicated and potentially difficult. I won't lie and say everything will be simple or safe, but I can promise you'll be treated as an equal, that your thoughts will matter as much as mine, and that whatever we build together will be built on truth, even when truth is uncomfortable." Catherine read that passage 3 times, her heart beating hard against her ribs. He was warning her off, even as he invited her closer, giving her every reason to refuse, even as he hoped she wouldn't. Most men would have hidden their troubles, would have painted everything in golden tones until she was already committed and couldn't escape. But Daniel Merrick was handing her the truth and trusting her to decide what to do with it. She wrote back that same evening, her response matching his honesty with her own. She told him she wasn't afraid of complicated, that she'd rather face hard truths than comfortable lies, that she'd spent her entire life navigating difficult situations with people who smiled while undermining each other. And at least in Wyoming, she might find conflict that was honest about being conflict. Over the next 3 months, they wrote back and forth, the letters arriving with increasing frequency as if both of them were racing toward a decision they knew was inevitable. He told her about the ranch he'd built with his own hands, about the small community of Blackwater, about the challenges of making law matter in a place where justice was still being negotiated between individual will and collective survival. She told him about Boston's rigid hierarchies, about being educated beyond what her world could absorb, about wanting to matter in ways that went beyond performing femininity correctly. In his 7th letter, he asked her directly, "Come to Blackwater, marry me, build this life with me. It won't be easy, and I can't promise you comfort or certainty. But I can promise you partnership, honesty, and the chance to find out who you are when no one's watching to correct you." Catherine sat with that letter for 2 days, weighing everything she'd lose against everything she might gain. She'd lose her family, her security, the certainty of knowing exactly what her life would look like in 10 years. But she'd gain possibility, agency, the chance to discover whether she was brave enough to become the person she'd always suspected she could be. On the morning of the 3rd day, she went downstairs to breakfast and told her mother she was leaving. The explosion that followed was spectacular. Tears, accusations, predictions of ruin and disgrace. Her mother called her ungrateful, foolish, selfish. Her brother tried to reason with her, suggesting she was having some kind of breakdown. But Rebecca just hugged her tightly and whispered, "Write to me about everything. Promise me you'll write." Catherine packed a single trunk with practical dresses, her father's medical books, and every letter Daniel had sent her. She bought a ticket on the Union Pacific Railway with money she'd saved from the small inheritance her father had left her, an amount her mother had always meant to control but had never quite gotten around to managing. The morning she left, the house was silent, her mother refusing to see her off, her brother at his office, her absence from their lives already being rewritten as a shameful episode best forgotten. Only Rebecca came to the station, her eyes red but her spine straight. "You're the bravest person I know," she said as the train hissed and prepared to depart. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Catherine climbed aboard with her trunk and her hope, finding a seat by the window as the train pulled away from everything she'd ever known. She watched Boston shrink behind her, the familiar streets and buildings giving way to countryside she'd never paid attention to before. Her hands were steady, her breathing even, And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the fear and uncertainty, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation. Not the dread of another disappointing social season, or the resignation of watching life happen to other people, but genuine excitement about what might be waiting at the end of this journey. She was traveling toward Daniel Merrick, toward Wyoming, toward a life she couldn't predict or control. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Catherine Whitmore felt completely, terrifyingly alive. The train carried Catherine westward through landscapes that seemed to expand with each passing mile, as if the world itself was learning to breathe deeper. She watched Massachusetts forests give way to the flat expanse of the Great Plains, where the horizon stretched so far it made her eyes ache. Other passengers came and went at various stops, farmers returning from selling livestock, families chasing rumors of gold in the Black Hills, women traveling in tight-lipped silence toward futures they'd negotiated through correspondence. Catherine kept largely to herself, though she couldn't help observing the microcosm of humanity sharing these crowded cars. On the third day, somewhere in Nebraska, a woman roughly her age sat down across from her during a water stop. She was thin, with work-worn hands and eyes that held the particular wariness of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment. "Heading west to marry?" she asked without preamble, nodding at the small bundle of letters Catherine had been rereading. There seemed no point in denying it. Wyoming territory, a ranch near Blackwater. The woman's expression shifted, something like sympathy crossing her features. "I'm going to Colorado myself. Second marriage. First husband died in a mine collapse, left me with 3 children and debts that swallowed everything we'd built." She paused, studying Catherine more carefully. "You look educated. Probably came from means. What drives a woman like you to answer an advertisement?" Catherine considered the question, realizing she'd been asking herself the same thing in different ways since leaving Boston. "I suppose I got tired of being something I'm not. Tired of making myself smaller so others could feel larger." The woman nodded slowly. "Well, the West doesn't suffer pretense much. It'll either make you stronger or break you clean through, but at least you'll know which you are when it's done." She stood as the train whistle blew, preparing to disembark at the next stop. "Piece of advice, though. Whatever you're expecting when you get there, expect something different. The men who write those letters are showing you one side. Reality usually has more edges than promises do." The words stayed with Catherine long after the woman had gone. She found herself looking at Daniel's letters differently, reading between the lines for what he might not have said, what complications he might have minimized or avoided altogether. He'd been honest about conflict with a neighbor, about being seen as difficult by some in the community. But those were abstract troubles, carefully worded observations. What would they mean in practice? What was waiting for her beyond the romance of correspondence? The train pushed deeper into territories where settlements grew sparser, where the land seemed to resist human ambition with casual indifference. They passed through Wyoming in early autumn, the mountains rising like ancient sentinels, snow already dusting their peaks despite the warmth in the valleys below. Other passengers pointed out landmarks, Independence Rock, the Sweetwater River, places that had meaning in the mythology of Western expansion. Catherine pressed her face to the window, trying to absorb it all. This vast country that seemed to operate by different rules than the carefully ordered world she'd left behind. The towns they passed through were raw and unfinished, buildings that looked temporary even when they weren't, streets that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. She saw men carrying rifles as casually as Boston gentlemen carried walking sticks, women hanging laundry between buildings that would have been considered unfit for storage back home. This was the world she'd chosen, and with each mile, the weight of that choice grew more real. The final leg of the journey took her from Cheyenne to Blackwater on a smaller spur line that serviced the ranching communities scattered through the southeastern part of the territory. The car was half empty, filled mostly with men who smelled of cattle and tobacco, their conversation rough and direct, utterly different from the coded politeness of Boston society. Catherine kept her eyes on the window, watching the landscape shift from grassland to something more broken and beautiful. Rocky outcroppings, stands of cottonwood along creek beds, distances that seemed to mock the idea of neighbors. When the conductor finally called Blackwater, her stomach clenched with a mixture of anticipation and fear that made breathing difficult. The platform was nothing more than a raised wooden walkway beside the tracks, weathered boards that creaked under her weight as she stepped down. The town itself sprawled behind it in no particular order, buildings arranged according to whoever had claimed the land first, rather than any coherent plan. She counted perhaps 20 structures, a general store, a saloon, what looked like a doctor's office, and various other establishments she couldn't immediately identify. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks catching the late afternoon light, and the air smelled of sage and wood smoke and something indefinable that might have been possibility or might have been dust. Her trunk landed beside her with a heavy thud, and she stood there scanning the handful of people scattered around the platform, looking for a man she'd never seen but whose words she'd memorized. No one approached. A few townspeople glanced her way with the casual curiosity of those accustomed to strangers arriving and departing, but no one showed recognition or welcome. Catherine's heart began to beat faster, uncertainty creeping up her spine like cold water. The train hissed and prepared to depart, and suddenly she was alone on the platform with her trunk and her carefully constructed hope, neither of which seemed particularly useful at the moment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Miss Whitmore. The voice came from behind her, and Catherine turned to find a woman approaching, perhaps 40 years old, with steel-grey hair pulled into a practical knot and eyes that assessed without judgment. "I'm Margaret Porter. I run the boarding house here in town." Catherine nodded, relief flooding through her at hearing her own name. At this small confirmation that she'd arrived at the right place, that someone had been expecting her. "I'm looking for Daniel Merrick. He was supposed to meet me." Margaret's expression shifted, sympathy and something darker crossing her features in quick succession. "Yes, well, there've been some developments since your last correspondence. Daniel's currently detained at the Territorial Marshal's office." The words landed like physical blows, each one requiring Catherine to recalibrate everything she thought she understood. "Detained? What does that mean, detained?" Margaret glanced around, clearly uncomfortable having this conversation in public. "Let's get your trunk to the boarding house, and I'll explain everything." "It's not a conversation for the platform." They walked in silence, Margaret carrying one end of the trunk despite Catherine's protests, moving down what passed for Blackwater's main street. Catherine was aware of people watching, of conversations pausing as they passed, of the weight of speculation in the air. Whatever had happened to Daniel, it was clearly public knowledge. The kind of event that gave a small-town material for weeks of discussion. The boarding house was a 2-story structure that looked more solid than most of the surrounding buildings, with actual glass in the windows and a sign that had been painted with some care. Margaret led her inside to a small room on the 2nd floor, simple but clean, with a bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the street. Once they were alone with the door closed, Margaret sat heavily in the room's single chair and gestured for Catherine to sit on the bed. "How much did Daniel tell you about his situation here?" "About the conflict with Victor Dalton." Catherine searched her memory, trying to recall the details from his letters. "He mentioned a neighbor who was difficult, disputes over water rights and land boundaries. He said some people saw him as troublesome." Margaret made a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so bitter. "That's one way of putting it. Victor Dalton owns the largest ranch in this area, has money and influence that extends to the territorial government. Daniel's land sits between Dalton's property and the best water source for 50 miles. For 2 years, Dalton's been trying to buy Daniel out, offering money first, then making threats when money didn't work. Daniel refused to sell, said his ranch was his future and he wasn't going to hand it over to a bully just because the bully had deeper pockets. She paused, her hands folding and unfolding in her lap. 4 days ago, Victor Dalton was shot. They found him in the canyon between his property and Daniel's, dead from a bullet to the chest. Daniel was discovered nearby with a rifle, and there were witnesses who'd heard him threaten Dalton the week before during an argument at the general store. Catherine felt the room tilt, her carefully constructed future collapsing into something unrecognizable. But he didn't do it. She said it as a statement, not a question, surprised by her own certainty. Margaret looked at her with something between pity and respect. You don't know that. You don't know him at all, not really. Letters are just words, and words can hide all manner of truth. But Catherine shook her head, thinking of those letters, of the voice that had come through them, thoughtful, honest even when honesty reflected poorly on him. Careful with language in a way that suggested someone who understood the weight of what he wrote. If he'd wanted to kill someone, he wouldn't have been caught standing over the body with the weapon. He's too intelligent for that. Margaret stood, moving to the window. Intelligence doesn't always matter when rage takes over. And Daniel had reason for rage. Dalton had his cattle rustled twice. His water rights challenged through legal channels that cost money Daniel didn't have, and there were rumors Dalton had hired men to intimidate him, to make life difficult enough that selling would seem like relief. She turned back to Catherine. I'm not saying Daniel did it. I'm saying the evidence makes a convincing story, and in territories like this, where law is still more idea than institution, a convincing story is often all a jury needs. Catherine stood as well, squaring her shoulders in a gesture her mother would have recognized, the moment when politeness gave way to determination. I want to see him. Margaret studied her for a long moment. The marshal's office is 3 buildings down, but prepare yourself. He's in irons and he's not in good condition. Whatever you thought you were coming here to find, this is what's actually waiting. They walked back out into the late afternoon light, and Catherine was acutely aware of how many eyes tracked their progress. News of her arrival had clearly spread, and she could imagine the conversations already taking place behind closed doors. The foolish Eastern woman who'd traveled all this way to marry a murderer. The scandal and entertainment she represented. The marshal's office was a squat building with barred windows, built more solidly than most structures in town, designed to contain rather than welcome. Inside, a man looked up from a desk covered in paperwork, his face weathered by sun and wind, his eyes the particular shade of tired that comes from seeing too much human nature at its worst. Marshal Garrett, Margaret said by way of introduction. This is Catherine Whitmore. She's come from Boston to marry Daniel Merrick. The marshal's expression didn't change, though something flickered in his eyes that might have been sympathy. Miss Whitmore, I'm sorry your arrival coincided with these circumstances. Daniel's being held pending trial, which is scheduled for 2 weeks from now. Judge Harper will be arriving from the territorial circuit. Catherine found her voice, though it emerged shakier than she'd intended. I'd like to see him. The marshal exchanged a look with Margaret, a silent conversation that Catherine couldn't quite interpret. 5 minutes, he finally said, and I'll be present throughout. He stood, keys jangling at his belt, and led her through a reinforced door into the back of the building. The cell area was dim, lit only by narrow windows near the ceiling, and the air smelled of earth and metal and unwashed bodies. There were 3 cells, 2 empty, and in the third, sitting on a wooden bench with his head bowed, was a man in chains. Daniel Merrick looked up at the sound of footsteps, and Catherine's breath caught in her throat. He was younger than she'd imagined, perhaps 35, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were an unexpected shade of blue, startling in the dimness. His face was bruised along one cheekbone, his shirt torn at the shoulder, and the iron shackles on his wrists and ankles marked him as dangerous, as guilty before any trial had rendered judgment. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. 2 people who'd shared intimate thoughts through letters, but had never occupied the same physical space until now. Meeting in the worst possible circumstances. Catherine. He said her name like a prayer, and a curse combined, his voice rough with exhaustion. God, you shouldn't be here. You should have stayed in Boston. He stood slowly, the chains rattling with the movement, and moved closer to the bars that separated them. I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry. Catherine stepped forward, until only the iron bars stood between them. Close enough now to see the exhaustion in his face, the resignation in his eyes, the shame of being seen like this by someone he'd hoped to meet so differently. Tell me what happened, she said quietly. All of it. Everything you didn't write in your letters. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, his jaw working as if the words required physical effort. Dalton and I had been fighting for 2 years. He wanted my land, wanted control of the water that runs through it, and he was willing to do whatever it took to force me out. Last week we had a confrontation in town. I told him I'd die before I sold to him, that he could take his money and threats and choke on them. He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze directly. I was angry and stupid, and I said it loud enough for half the town to hear. 3 days later, I was checking fence lines near the canyon that marks our property boundary, and I heard a gunshot. I found Dalton on the ground, bleeding out, the rifle lying next to him. I picked it up without thinking, trying to understand what I was seeing, and that's when Dalton's ranch hands arrived. They saw me standing over him with the weapon, and nothing I said mattered after that. Catherine studied his face, searching for deception and finding only raw truth. You didn't kill him. She said it with certainty, not because she was naive, but because she'd spent months learning to read this man's voice through his writing, learning the cadence of his honesty. No, but I can't prove it, and circumstance is a powerful witness against me. He reached through the bars, stopping just short of touching her hand. Go back to Boston, Catherine. This isn't what you signed up for. I won't hold you to promises made when I was a free man with a future. I'm likely headed for a noose or a territorial prison, neither of which includes the life I offered you. But Catherine didn't move. She thought about the woman on the train, about expecting something different, about the West not suffering pretense. She thought about Daniel's letters, about a man who'd warned her that coming here would be complicated, who'd given her every reason to refuse, even as he'd invited her closer. And she thought about herself, about the person she'd been in Boston, careful, constrained, slowly disappearing into the requirements of a world that had no room for who she actually was. I didn't travel 2,000 miles to turn around at the first sign of difficulty, she said firmly. I came here to meet Daniel Merrick. I came here to build a life with him. Chains don't change that. Something shifted in his expression, disbelief warring with desperate hope. You don't know what you're saying. You don't understand how this works here. The trial won't be fair. The evidence is circumstantial but compelling, and Dalton's family has influence that extends to every corner of this territory. Even if I wanted to fight this, I'm not sure there's a fight to be had. Catherine gripped the bars, her knuckles whitening with the pressure. Then we'll find one. There has to be something. Evidence, witnesses, someone who actually saw what happened. You said you heard the shot. That means someone else fired it. That means the real killer is still out there. Marshal Garrett's voice cut through the moment. Time's up, Miss Whitmore. Catherine held Daniel's gaze for one more heartbeat. I'm staying. We'll figure this out together. I didn't come all this way to give up on you before we've even begun. As the marshal led her back toward the front office, she heard Daniel's voice, rough with emotion. Thank you. God help me, thank you. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Margaret was waiting, her expression unreadable. You're really staying then, despite everything. Catherine looked at the town around her, this raw place where law was still negotiable and justice was something people had to fight for rather than assume. I spent my whole life in a world where everything was decided before I arrived, who I should be, how I should act, what future was acceptable. For once I get to decide, and I'm deciding to stay. Margaret nodded slowly, something like approval in her tired eyes. Then you better prepare yourself. This town's already made up its mind about Daniel, and you staying will make you complicit in whatever guilt they've assigned him. People won't be kind. Catherine thought of Boston, of cold politeness and calculated exclusion, of how cruel people could be while maintaining perfect manners. I've survived unkindness before. At least here, if someone has a problem with me, they'll say it to my face instead of behind a fan at a society luncheon. As they walked back toward the boarding house through the gathering dusk, Catherine felt the weight of what she'd committed to settling onto her shoulders. She'd come west expecting a challenge, expecting to be tested, but she'd imagined those tests would involve adapting to ranch life, learning new skills, building a partnership with a man she'd only known through letters. Instead, she'd arrived to find that man in chains, accused of murder, facing a trial that seemed predetermined toward conviction. She'd have to learn this town, understand its dynamics, figure out who might have actually killed Victor Dalton and why. She'd have to become someone who asked hard questions and refused easy answers, someone brave enough to stand beside a man everyone else had already judged. It should have terrified her. Instead, as she climbed the stairs to her rented room and looked out at the strange landscape of her new home, Catherine felt that same fierce anticipation she'd experienced on the train. She'd chosen this. She'd walked away from certainty and toward possibility, and now possibility was showing her exactly how complicated freedom could be. Tomorrow, she'd begin asking questions. Tonight, she simply stood at the window and wondered who she was becoming. Catherine woke to a sound she'd never heard before, the long, mournful call of a coyote somewhere in the hills beyond town. Dawn was just beginning to break, painting her rented room in shades of grey and amber, and for a disorienting moment she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The train journey, the empty platform, Daniel in chains, the impossible situation she'd walked into with her eyes wide open. She dressed quickly in her simpler traveling dress, the one that wouldn't immediately mark her as an outsider, though she suspected nothing could truly disguise that fact. Downstairs, Margaret was already moving through the boarding house kitchen with the efficient grace of someone who'd performed the same tasks 1,000 times. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the small space, and Catherine's stomach reminded her she'd barely eaten since arriving. "There's breakfast," Margaret said without turning around. "And after you eat, we need to talk about practicalities. You can't stay here indefinitely on charity, and I assume you came with limited funds." Catherine poured herself coffee and sat at the worn wooden table. "I have some money, enough for a few weeks, maybe a month if I'm careful. After that," she trailed off, realizing she hadn't actually planned beyond arriving and marrying Daniel. Beyond stepping into the life he'd described in his letters. Margaret turned, spatula in hand, her expression pragmatic rather than unkind. "After that you'll need work. I could use help here at the boarding house. Cooking, cleaning, laundry. It's not glamorous, and it won't pay much. But it'll cover your room and give you a small wage." Catherine nodded, trying not to think about how her mother would react to the news that her educated daughter was scrubbing floors and washing sheets in a Wyoming boarding house. "Thank you. I'll take it." She paused, then added, "I also need to understand what happened. The murder, the conflict between Daniel and Victor Dalton, all of it. If I'm going to help Daniel, I need to know what I'm working with." Margaret set down the spatula and sat across from her, the morning light catching the lines around her eyes, evidence of years spent in this harsh country. "You understand that asking questions will make you unpopular. People here have already decided what happened, and they don't take kindly to outsiders challenging their conclusions." Catherine met her gaze steadily. "I didn't come here to be popular. I came here to build a life with Daniel, and I can't do that if he's convicted of a crime he didn't commit." Margaret studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, I'll tell you what I know. But understand that what I know and what I can prove are different things." She described the geography first. Daniel's ranch sat in a valley with good grazing land, bordered on the east by a creek that provided the only reliable water source for miles. Victor Dalton's much larger operation sprawled across the adjacent territory, and for years he'd been systematically acquiring surrounding properties, building an empire that required constant water access. When Daniel had staked his claim and refused repeated offers to sell, it had created a conflict that went beyond simple neighborly disagreement. Dalton had money, connections to the territorial government, and a reputation for getting what he wanted, regardless of the methods required. There were incidents, Margaret said, her voice dropping lower. Cattle gone missing from Daniel's herd, fences cut in the night, supplies stolen from his barn. Nothing that could be directly traced to Dalton, but everyone knew. Catherine absorbed this, her mind working through the implications. If Dalton was the one causing problems, why would Daniel kill him? That only makes his own situation worse. Margaret's expression turned grim. Because 3 weeks ago, Dalton filed a legal claim, saying the creek's water rights belonged to his property based on some old territorial survey. If that claim had been upheld, Daniel's ranch would have been worthless. You can't run cattle without water in this country. Daniel challenged it, hired a lawyer he couldn't afford, and they were scheduled for a hearing in front of the territorial judge. Then Dalton ended up dead and the hearing never happened. Catherine set down her coffee cup carefully. So who benefits from Dalton's death?
That's the question, isn't it?
Margaret stood, returning to her cooking. Dalton's son Roland takes over the ranch now. He's younger, less patient than his father, and he's been vocal about wanting Daniel hanged for what happened. But there are others. Dalton had disputes with half the ranchers in this area, squeezed out small operators, played legal games with boundaries and water rights. He made plenty of enemies. She slid eggs and bacon onto a plate and set it in front of Catherine. The problem is, none of those other enemies were found standing over the body with a rifle. Daniel was, and circumstance is a powerful thing, in territories where law is still being figured out as we go. After breakfast, Catherine walked through Blackwater's main street, trying to get a sense of the town and its rhythms. Men stood in clusters outside the general store, their conversation stopping when she passed, resuming in lower tones after she'd moved on. Women watched from windows, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. She stopped at the general store, needing supplies, but also wanting to hear what people were saying, to understand the mood of the community. The proprietor was a heavy-set man, with thinning hair and suspicious eyes. "Help you?" he asked without warmth. "I need soap, thread and paper if you have it," Catherine replied, keeping her voice neutral. He gathered the items slowly, making a show of tallying the cost. "You're the woman who came for Merrick," he said. Not quite a question. "Seems like a long way to travel for nothing." Catherine handed him the money. "I don't consider it nothing," he snorted, making change with deliberate slowness. Merrick's guilty as sin. Half the town heard him threaten Dalton, and he was caught with the murder weapon. "Judge'll convict him quick, and we'll have a hanging before winter." The casual certainty in his voice made Catherine's stomach clench, but she kept her expression calm. What if he's innocent? What if someone else killed Dalton and left Daniel to take the blame? The storekeeper leaned across the counter, his voice dropping to something between warning and threat. "Listen, miss. I don't know how things work back east, but here we handle our own justice. Dalton was a pillar of this community, employed half the people in this valley, contributed to the church and the school. Merrick was a troublemaker who couldn't accept that some men are just bigger than others, that fighting the natural order only brings pain." He straightened, handing her the package. "You'd do well to get back on the train and forget about men who don't know their place." Catherine took her purchases, her hands steady, despite the anger building in her chest. "Thank you for your time," she said evenly. Refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled, outside, she nearly collided with a young man who'd been standing near the door, clearly listening to the exchange. He was perhaps 25, dressed in work clothes that had seen better days, with sandy hair and eyes that held both caution and something like approval. "Don't mind Fletcher," he said quietly, glancing back at the store. He's been in Dalton's pocket for years, extended credit that kept his business afloat when the mining operations dried up. He's not exactly an objective witness. Catherine studied him, trying to place whether he was a friend or a threat. "And you are?" The young man extended his hand. "James Caldwell. I worked for Daniel at his ranch. Been trying to keep things going while he's locked up. But it's getting harder without him there." Catherine shook his hand, relief flooding through her at finding someone who didn't immediately assume Daniel's guilt. "Catherine Whitmore. I was supposed to marry him when I arrived." James's expression softened. "He talked about you. Showed me some of your letters. Asked my opinion on whether he was being fair, whether he was being honest enough about the difficulties here." He paused, looking around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "He didn't kill Dalton, Miss Whitmore. I know him, known him for 3 years. He's got a temper when pushed, and he's stubborn as granite, but he's not a murderer. And more than that, he's too smart to get caught standing over a body if he'd actually done it." Catherine felt something loosen in her chest, the relief of finding an ally in this hostile place. "Then who did kill Dalton? And why is everyone so convinced it was Daniel?" James gestured toward a bench outside the closed barber shop. "Can we sit? This isn't a short story." They sat, and James told her what he knew from a different angle than Margaret's pragmatic summary. He described the escalating conflict from Daniel's perspective, the systematic harassment, the legal maneuvering, the sense that Dalton was trying to break him through attrition rather than direct confrontation. "Daniel was worried," James admitted. "The water rights case was everything. If he lost that, the ranch was finished. He'd poured his life savings into that land, worked it from nothing, and Dalton was going to take it with legal paperwork and corrupt surveys." "But you said he wouldn't kill," Catherine pressed. "Why are you so certain?" James looked at her directly. "Because the day before Dalton died, Daniel got word that his lawyer had found evidence the survey Dalton was using was fraudulent, that someone had altered the territorial records. Daniel was celebrating. He knew he was going to win the water rights case legally. He had no reason to risk everything by killing Dalton when he was about to beat him in court." Catherine's mind raced with the implications. "Does Marshal Garrett know about this? Does anyone?" James's expression turned bitter. "Daniel's lawyer knows, and he's supposed to present it at the trial. But the lawyer's young, inexperienced, and he's going up against the territorial prosecutor and a judge who's known to side with property owners. Plus, with Daniel caught at the scene, the evidence about the survey seems circumstantial compared to the physical facts." Catherine stood, pacing in front of the bench. "There has to be more. If Daniel had proof he was going to win legally, then his motive for murder disappears. But someone still killed Dalton. Who else benefits from him being dead?" James considered this. Roland Dalton inherits everything, but why would he kill his own father? They were close, worked together running the ranch. He paused, thinking. "Though I did hear they'd been arguing recently. Roland wanted to expand operations faster, take on more debt to acquire more land. Victor was more conservative, wanted to build slowly. But arguing with your father isn't the same as killing him. What about Dalton's ranch hands?" Catherine asked. "The ones who found Daniel at the scene. What do we know about them?" James shifted uncomfortably. 2 men, Frank Sutton and Pete Morgan. They're loyal to the Dalton family, been working that ranch for years. They claim they heard the shot, came running, and found Daniel standing over the body with the rifle. He lowered his voice further. "But here's what's strange. The canyon where it happened is about half a mile from the Dalton ranch house. Why were they close enough to hear the shot and arrive so quickly? That's rough terrain, not easy to cover at speed. And why were they together rather than doing separate work?" Catherine filed this away, her investigative instincts beginning to sharpen. "I need to talk to them." James shook his head firmly. "They won't talk to you. You're associated with Daniel now, and the Daltons have made it clear that anyone who helps him will find themselves without work in this valley. Most people depend on Dalton's operation one way or another. They buy supplies from him, sell him cattle, work his land during busy seasons. Going against the family is economic suicide. Catherine sat back down, frustration building. So everyone's too afraid to tell the truth, even if they know it. How is Daniel supposed to get a fair trial in these conditions? He's not, James said simply. That's the problem. This isn't Boston or New York, where you have established legal systems and protections. Out here, justice is whatever the people with power say it is. And right now, the Daltons have all the power. They sat in silence for a moment. The morning sun climbing higher, the town continuing its daily rhythms around them. Finally, Catherine spoke. You mentioned Daniel's lawyer found evidence of the fraudulent survey. I need to talk to him, see what he knows. And I need to understand the timeline better. When exactly was Dalton killed? When was Daniel found? What's the gap between those two events? James stood, brushing dust from his pants. The lawyer's name is Thomas Fletcher. He caught Catherine's expression. No relation to the storekeeper, thank God. He's got an office above the saloon, though calling it an office is generous. And about the timeline, that's something I've been wondering about too. They walked together toward the saloon, James explaining as they went. Dalton was killed sometime around mid-morning, based on how warm the body still was when people arrived. Daniel says he heard the shot while checking fence lines, rode toward the sound, and found Dalton already dying. He estimates maybe 5 minutes passed between the shot and when he arrived at the scene. Then another 5 minutes before Sutton and Morgan showed up. Catherine processed this. So in that 5-minute window, the real killer shot Dalton and disappeared, leaving Daniel to take the blame, which means the killer either knew Daniel would be nearby or got incredibly lucky that someone else showed up to become the scapegoat. Or, James said slowly, the killer arranged for Daniel to be there, set him up deliberately. They reached the saloon, and James pointed to an external staircase leading to the second floor. Fletcher's up there. He's not much, but he's all Daniel could afford. Most lawyers with real experience won't take cases against the Daltons. Not enough money in it, too much risk of angering people who matter. Catherine started up the stairs, then turned back. James, why are you helping me? You said yourself that going against the Daltons is dangerous for anyone who works in this valley. James met her eyes, and she saw something fierce there beneath the caution. Because Daniel gave me a job when I had nothing, treated me like I mattered, taught me about ranching, and trusted me to do good work. And because, if we let innocent men hang just because they're inconvenient to powerful people, then we might as well admit this whole experiment in civilization out here is a failure. Thomas Fletcher's office was a single room with a desk, 2 chairs, and stacks of law books that looked like they'd been read more than consulted. Fletcher himself was perhaps 30, thin and serious, with ink-stained fingers and the haunted look of someone carrying a case he knew he was likely to lose. He looked up when Catherine knocked, surprise crossing his face. Miss Whitmore, Daniel said you might arrive any day, though I don't think he expected it to be now, under these circumstances. Catherine sat without waiting for an invitation. Tell me about the fraudulent survey. James Caldwell says you found evidence that could clear Daniel's motive. Fletcher pulled out a file, spreading documents across his desk. The territorial survey Dalton was using to claim water rights dates back 15 years, supposedly showing the creek as originating on his property. But I found the original survey in the Territorial Archive in Cheyenne, and the current version has been altered. The creek's path has been moved on paper to favor Dalton's claim. He showed her the differences. His finger tracing where lines had been changed, where notations had been added in different ink. This is significant evidence. It shows Dalton was willing to commit fraud to get what he wanted, and more importantly, it means Daniel had no motive to kill him. Daniel knew we had this evidence and would present it at the water rights hearing. He was going to win legally. Catherine studied the documents, hope rising in her chest. This proves Daniel's innocence, but Fletcher's expression remained troubled. It proves he had no motive. It doesn't prove he didn't kill Dalton in a moment of rage or revenge for all the harassment he'd endured. And it doesn't explain why he was found at the scene with the murder weapon. The prosecutor will argue that discovering the fraud might have actually triggered Daniel to act that he was so angry about being cheated that he decided to take justice into his own hands rather than trust the legal system. Catherine sat back, frustration mounting. So even good evidence can be twisted to support guilt. Welcome to frontier justice, Fletcher said grimly. The facts matter less than the story you can tell with them, and right now, the prosecutor has a very compelling story. Violent man threatens property owner, gets caught cheating in legal system, decides to kill him rather than risk losing everything. He paused. What we need is evidence that someone else pulled that trigger. A witness who saw something. Physical evidence that points to another shooter. Something concrete that creates reasonable doubt. Catherine thought of Sutton and Morgan, the two ranch hands who'd arrived so conveniently. What do we know about the men who found Daniel? Is their story credible? Fletcher shuffled through more papers. They gave statements to Marshal Garrett. Both say they were working in the south pasture, heard the shot, rode toward it together, found Daniel standing over Dalton. Their timeline matches Daniel's in terms of when they arrived, but... He trailed off, looking troubled. But what? Catherine leaned forward. But they were supposed to be working separate sections that day, according to the work schedule. I don't know why they were together, and when I asked during preliminary questions, they got defensive, said plans changed. It's probably nothing, but it's bothered me. Catherine felt a thread of something pulling at her mind, not quite a theory, but the beginning of one. What if it's not nothing? What if they needed to be together because they knew something was going to happen? Fletcher looked at her sharply. You're suggesting they were involved? That's a serious accusation without evidence. Catherine stood, restless energy driving her to pace. I'm not suggesting anything yet. But I am saying we need to question everything we've been told, especially by people who benefit from the current narrative. She turned back to him. Can you get me access to the scene? The canyon where it happened? I want to see it for myself, understand the geography. Fletcher hesitated. It's on Dalton property now. Roland Dalton would never give permission. Catherine smiled grimly. Then I suppose I'll have to see it without permission. Can James Caldwell guide me there? Fletcher shook his head, but she could see he was reconsidering his assessment of her. You're going to make enemies doing this. Powerful ones. I already have enemies, Catherine replied. The difference is now I'm choosing them instead of inheriting them. She spent the rest of the day preparing, talking with James about the best route to the canyon, learning what she could about the Dalton operation and its employees. That evening, she visited Daniel again, the marshal allowing her 10 minutes under his watchful eye. Daniel looked worse than he had the day before, the bruise on his face darker, his exhaustion more profound. But when he saw her, something in his expression lightened. You're still here, he said softly, as if he'd half expected her to disappear like a dream. I told you I was staying. Catherine moved close to the bars. I talked to James and your lawyer. I know about the fraudulent survey, about the harassment, about everything you didn't tell me in your letters. Daniel's jaw tightened. I didn't want to scare you away. Catherine reached through the bars and took his shackled hand, the iron cold against her skin. I'm not easily scared, and I'm not running. She told him about her conversations, about the questions she was asking, about the inconsistencies she was beginning to notice. Daniel listened, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. You understand this could be dangerous? If someone set me up, if someone killed Dalton deliberately and arranged for me to be blamed, they won't want you uncovering that truth. Catherine squeezed his hand gently. I understand, but I also understand that if we don't fight this, you'll hang for something you didn't do. And I didn't come all this way to watch that happen. Why? Daniel asked, his voice rough with emotion. Why are you doing this? You don't owe me anything. We're strangers who wrote letters. Catherine smiled, surprising herself with the certainty she felt. We're not strangers. I know your mind, your values, the way you think about the world. I know you well enough to recognize honesty when I see it, even when that honesty is standing in chains. And maybe I'm also doing this for myself, because for the first time in my life, I get to fight for something that matters, something I chose. I won't waste that chance just because it's difficult. Marshal Garrett's voice interrupted them. Time's up. Catherine held Daniel's gaze for one more moment. I'll be back tomorrow, and I promise you we're going to find the truth. As she walked back to the boarding house through the darkening streets, Catherine felt the weight of what she'd committed to settling more heavily on her shoulders. She was alone in a hostile town, investigating a murder in a place where law was still being negotiated, facing people who had every reason to want her gone. But she also felt more alive than she had in years, more purposeful, more certain that she was exactly where she needed to be. Tomorrow she'd visit the canyon. Tomorrow she'd start piecing together what really happened. Tonight she simply lay in her narrow bed and listened to the coyotes call, and thought about a man in chains who'd accidentally given her permission to become someone brave. The pre-dawn air carried a bite that reminded Catherine. Winter was approaching faster than she'd anticipated. She stood outside the boarding house, wrapped in a borrowed coat, waiting for James Caldwell to arrive with horses. Margaret had tried to talk her out of this plan over coffee an hour earlier, warning that trespassing on Dalton property could get her arrested or worse. Catherine had listened politely and then packed a small satchel with paper, pencil, and the determination that had carried her 2,000 miles from everything she'd known. James appeared as the eastern sky began to lighten, leading 2 horses and wearing an expression caught between admiration and concern. "Last chance to reconsider," he said quietly, helping her mount. "Once we're on Dalton land, we're committed. If Roland's men find us, this could go badly." Catherine settled into the saddle, grateful for the riding lessons her father had insisted on years ago, back when he'd still believed the world might have room for adventurous daughters. Then we'd better not get caught. They rode out of Blackwater as the town still slept, moving through terrain that shifted from grassland to rocky outcroppings as they approached the disputed boundary between Daniel's ranch and the Dalton Empire. The canyon revealed itself gradually, a slash in the landscape where weather and time had carved away softer rock, leaving walls of striated stone rising 30 feet on either side. A creek ran through the bottom during wet seasons, James explained, the same water source that had sparked years of conflict. Now in autumn, only scattered pools remained, reflecting the morning sky like scattered mirrors. "This is where it happened," James said, dismounting near a cluster of boulders. Daniel found Dalton approximately there. He pointed to a relatively flat area near the canyon's south wall, sheltered from view by the surrounding rock formations. Catherine dismounted and walked carefully toward the spot, trying to see it with fresh eyes, trying to understand what had happened here. The ground still showed signs of disturbance, darker patches where blood had soaked into the earth, scuff marks where people had moved around the scene. The general chaos of a place where violence had erupted and been documented by men who cared more about guilt than truth. She knelt near the bloodstain, pulling out her paper and beginning to sketch the layout. "Show me exactly where Daniel was standing when the ranch hands arrived." James moved into position, his discomfort with the recreation obvious, but his willingness to help stronger. "And the rifle was where?" Catherine asked, making notes. James pointed to a spot near the boulder. According to their statements, the rifle was on the ground next to Dalton's body, and Daniel had just picked it up when they came around that bend. He indicated the curve in the canyon where the terrain blocked line of sight. Catherine stood, walking slowly through the sequence, trying to make the pieces fit. Something nagged at her, some detail that didn't align properly, but she couldn't quite grasp it. She moved to where Daniel would have approached, coming from his ranch to the north. The ride would have taken several minutes, even at speed, which matched his account of hearing the shot and arriving to find Dalton dying. But what about the killer? Where had they gone in those few minutes before Daniel arrived? Catherine scanned the canyon walls, looking for escape routes. The terrain was rough but not impassable. Someone on foot could have climbed out at several points, or they could have ridden hard in either direction. putting distance between themselves and the crime before anyone arrived to witness. "The ranch hands came from that direction?" she asked, pointing east. James nodded. "From the main Dalton property. But that's what I don't understand. That's easily a 20-minute ride, more if you're not pushing the horses hard. How did they arrive so quickly after the shot?" Catherine felt that nagging sensation grow stronger. Unless they were already nearby. She walked toward the eastern approach, studying the ground. Days had passed since the murder, and rain had fallen once, but she could still make out the impressions of horse traffic, multiple animals, coming and going in patterns she couldn't immediately interpret. "James, if you were going to watch this canyon without being seen, where would you position yourself?" He considered the question, then pointed to a ridge perhaps 50 yards east of the scene. "Up there. Good sightline, cover from the rocks, and you'd hear anything happening below." They climbed together, scrambling over loose stone and scrub brush until they reached the ridge. From this vantage, the entire kill site was visible, spread out like a stage viewed from the balcony. Catherine's heart began to beat faster. If someone was waiting here, watching, they could have seen everything. They could have seen the killer shoot Dalton, seen Daniel arrive, known exactly when to come down and discover the crime. James crouched beside her, following her logic. "You think Sutton and Morgan were up here? That they witnessed the murder but lied about it?" Catherine examined the area carefully, and then she saw it. A cigarette end, weathered but not ancient, tucked between two rocks where the wind couldn't easily reach it. She picked it up carefully, wrapping it in paper from her satchel. "Does Daniel smoke?" James shook his head. "Never. Can't stand the smell." Catherine felt pieces beginning to shift in her mind, not quite forming a complete picture, but suggesting the outline of one. What about the ranch hands? Sutton and Morgan? James's expression changed as understanding dawned. "Sutton smokes constantly. Everyone knows it because he's always asking for matches." Catherine stood, looking back down at the canyon, reimagining the scene. What if Sutton and Morgan hadn't simply arrived by chance? What if they'd been here, watching, waiting for something specific to happen? Before she could voice the theory, a sound reached them. Horses approaching from the east, multiple riders moving at speed. James grabbed her arm. "We need to go, now!" They scrambled down from the ridge, running for their own mounts, but the approaching riders were faster. 3 men rounded the bend before Catherine and James could reach their horses, cutting off their escape. The lead rider was young, perhaps 30, with Victor Dalton's strong jaw and eyes that held anger like a weapon. Roland Dalton reined in his horse hard, the animal snorting and dancing sideways. "Trespassing on my property. Disturbing a crime scene. You want to add more charges to what Merrick's already facing?" Catherine stepped forward, refusing to show the fear racing through her veins. "I'm trying to understand what actually happened here. Your father deserves justice, not just convenient blame." Roland's laugh was harsh. "Justice? My father's dead, shot in the back by a man who'd threatened him publicly. That's all the understanding anyone needs." He dismounted, moving closer with an easy confidence that came from years of getting his way. "You're that woman, aren't you? The one foolish enough to come all this way for a murderer. You should have stayed in whatever civilized place you came from." Behind him, the 2 other riders also dismounted, and Catherine recognized them from James's descriptions. Frank Sutton, older and weathered, with the telltale stains of tobacco on his fingers and teeth. And Pete Morgan, younger but harder, with eyes that never quite met hers directly. "These men found your father," Catherine said, her voice steadier than she felt. "They must have been remarkably close by to arrive as quickly as they did." "Where exactly were you working that day?" Sutton's hand moved to his belt, resting near a holstered pistol. "We already gave our statements to the marshal. We don't answer to some Eastern woman playing detective." Roland moved closer still, close enough that Catherine could smell whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. "You've got no business being here. No right to question my men or disturb my father's death site. Merrick killed him, and in 2 weeks he'll hang for it. The only question is whether you'll still be around to watch, or if you'll have the sense to leave before you get yourself into real trouble." The threat was unmistakable, and Catherine saw James tense beside her, calculating odds that clearly didn't favor them. 3 armed men against 2 unarmed investigators, miles from town with no witnesses. This could go very wrong very quickly, but Catherine had spent too many years backing down from confrontation, making herself smaller to avoid conflict, letting fear dictate her choices. "I found something interesting up on that ridge," she said, pulling out the wrapped cigarette end. "Evidence that someone was watching this canyon, waiting, positioned perfectly to see everything that happened. Makes me wonder what they were waiting for and what they actually saw." Sutton's expression flickered just for a second, but it was enough. "That could be from anyone, any time. Means nothing." Catherine smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Then you won't mind if I give it to the marshal? Let him decide if it means nothing." Roland's hand shot out, grabbing for the evidence, but Catherine was faster, stepping back and passing it to James, who tucked it inside his coat. "You're making a mistake," Roland said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "You're making enemies of people you can't afford to cross." Catherine held her ground. "I'm finding the truth. If that makes me your enemy, then I'd suggest examining why the truth threatens you so much." The standoff held for a moment that stretched too long, tension thick enough to cut. Then a voice called out from further up the canyon. "Everything all right here?" Marshal Garrett appeared on horseback. His timing so perfect, Catherine wondered if someone in town had warned him what she was planning. Behind him rode another man, older, with a badge that marked him as some kind of territorial authority. Roland's expression shuttered, the threat pulling back behind a mask of civility. "Just explaining to Miss Whitmore that trespassing on private property is illegal, Marshal." Garrett's weathered face showed nothing as he looked from Roland to Catherine. "Miss Whitmore, Mr. Caldwell, you'll need to come back to town with me. Now." It wasn't a request. The ride back to Blackwater was tense and silent. But Catherine noticed the marshal positioned himself between them and Roland's men, and he didn't ask her to surrender the cigarette end. Once they were far enough from the canyon, Garrett spoke without turning around. "That was remarkably foolish, Miss Whitmore. Roland Dalton isn't someone you antagonize without consequences." Catherine urged her horse alongside his. "Then perhaps someone should have been asking these questions weeks ago instead of accepting the easy answer." Garrett finally looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that might have been respect or might have been exhaustion. The easy answer is usually the right one. Man threatens another man, man ends up dead, threatening man found with the weapon. That's not convenient, that's straightforward. "Unless someone arranged it to look straightforward," Catherine countered. "Unless someone needed Victor Dalton dead and Daniel Merrick blamed, killing 2 birds with 1 bullet. The marshal was quiet for a moment. "That's a serious accusation with nothing but speculation supporting it." Catherine pulled out the wrapped cigarette. "This was on the ridge overlooking the crime scene, positioned perfectly to watch everything. Sutton smokes. He and Morgan claim they were working elsewhere when they heard the shot, but they arrived suspiciously fast. What if they were already there? What if they saw who really killed Dalton but lied about it?" Garrett took the evidence, examining it carefully. "1 cigarette end doesn't prove anything. Could have been left there weeks ago. Then test that theory," Catherine pressed. "Question them separately. Look for inconsistencies in their stories. Check the work logs to see if they were really supposed to be together that day. Do the basic investigating that should have been done from the start instead of accepting the first plausible narrative." The older man with Garrett spoke for the first time, his voice carrying authority. "She makes fair points, Marshal. I'm Judge Harper, Miss Whitmore. I'll be presiding over the trial. And while I appreciate your initiative, you should understand that frontier justice operates differently than what you're accustomed to in the East. We don't have the luxury of extensive investigations. We work with what's available and make judgments accordingly." Catherine met his eyes directly. "Then make sure what's available is actually the truth, rather than the version powerful people want you to believe." They reached Blackwater as the town was waking fully, people emerging from buildings and watching with undisguised curiosity as the marshal escorted Catherine and James down the main street. Garrett stopped outside his office. I'm going to question Sutton and Morgan again, separately like you suggested. But Miss Whitmore, you need to understand, even if there are inconsistencies in their testimony, that doesn't automatically prove Merrick's innocence. And it definitely doesn't prove who actually pulled the trigger. I know, Catherine said, dismounting. But it creates reasonable doubt, and reasonable doubt should be enough to prevent a hanging. The judge nodded thoughtfully. In theory, yes. In practice, we'll see. The trial begins in 10 days. If you have evidence to present, make sure Mr. Fletcher knows about it. He paused. I should also warn you, Roland Dalton has significant influence in this territory. Political connections, economic power. If he decides you're a genuine threat to his interests, he has ways of making life very difficult. Catherine thought of Boston, of social warfare conducted with smiles and whispers, of power wielded through exclusion and reputation. I've dealt with powerful men who hide behind civility before. Judge, at least here when someone threatens me, they're honest about it. After the marshal and judge departed, James walked with Catherine back toward the boarding house. That was either very brave or very reckless, he said quietly. I'm not sure which. Catherine managed a tired smile. Can't it be both? She gripped his arm briefly. Thank you for taking me there, for backing me up. I know it put you at risk. James shook his head. Daniel took me on when no one else would, taught me everything I know about ranching, treated me like family. If standing beside you helps clear his name, the risk is worth it. They parted ways, and Catherine climbed the stairs to her room, exhaustion pulling at her bones. But before she could rest, she needed to see Daniel, needed to tell him what she'd discovered. The marshal allowed her visit, though his expression suggested he was questioning his own judgment. Daniel stood when she entered, the chains rattling, his eyes searching her face. I heard you went to the canyon. Jesus, Catherine, you could have been hurt. She moved close to the bars, close enough to see the fear and anger warring in his expression. I found something. Evidence that Sutton and Morgan might have been watching from a ridge, that they might know more than they're saying. She told him everything, the cigarette end, the positioning, the suspicious timing, Roland's threats, the marshal's agreement to re-question the ranch hands. Daniel listened, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached through the bars and took her hand, the shackles cold against her skin. You shouldn't be doing this. Putting yourself in danger for me, antagonizing the Daltons, investigating a murder when you should be safe. Catherine squeezed his hand gently. Where exactly would I be safe? Back in Boston, suffocating in a life that had no room for who I actually am. I'm safer here fighting for something real than I ever was. They're pretending to be content. Daniel's thumb traced across her knuckles, a gesture so intimate it made her breath catch. I don't deserve this. You are traveling all this way, believing in me when everyone else has decided I'm guilty. You do deserve it, Catherine said firmly. And more than that, I deserve this, the chance to matter, to fight for something important, to be brave instead of careful. She paused, then added more softly, and I believe in you because I know you, Daniel. I know your mind, your values, the way you think about justice and second chances. I knew you through your letters long before I saw your face, and that kind of knowing doesn't lie. His eyes held hers, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with the murder or the trial or the impossible circumstances. Something that felt like recognition, like two people who'd been searching for each other, finally standing in the same space. When I get out of here, Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion, and I will get out because you won't let anything less happen. I'm going to marry you properly, not in desperation or gratitude, but because you're the bravest, most remarkable person I've ever known, and I want to spend whatever life I have left building something worthy of that bravery. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came from hope rather than despair. That's the best proposal anyone's ever offered me, she whispered. Even if it does come through prison bars. He smiled, and it transformed his face, showing her the man he'd been before chains and accusations had tried to break him. Marshal Garrett's voice interrupted the moment. Time's up. But as Catherine walked back toward the boarding house through the afternoon light, she felt something solid settling in her chest. Not just determination, but certainty. She'd found what she came west looking for, though it wore a different face than she'd imagined. She'd found purpose and partnership, found someone who saw her strength and valued it, rather than being threatened by it. And now, she just had to make sure they both survived long enough to build the life they'd promised each other in letters written across impossible distances. That evening, word came that Marshal Garrett had questioned Sutton and Morgan separately, and their stories had diverged in small but significant ways. The time they'd arrived at the scene shifted by several minutes between accounts. The location where they'd supposedly been working changed in Morgan's second telling. Small cracks in a story they'd clearly rehearsed but not perfectly memorized. It wasn't proof of innocence, but it was enough to make the marshal file an addendum to his initial report, noting inconsistencies that warranted further examination. Thomas Fletcher arrived at the boarding house after dark, his face alight with something Catherine hadn't seen before: hope. The judge agreed to allow new testimony about the fraudulent survey, and he's ordered Sutton and Morgan to appear at trial to explain the discrepancies in their statements. "We're not winning yet, but we're not losing by default anymore." Catherine sat with Fletcher and James in Margaret's kitchen, the three of them going over every detail, planning their strategy for the trial. For the first time since arriving in Blackwater, Catherine felt like they had a genuine chance. The truth was still murky, the killer still unknown, but at least now there was room for doubt, space for questions, possibility that justice might actually consider all the evidence rather than accepting the easiest explanation. As the night deepened and planning gave way to exhaustion, Catherine stood at her window, looking out at the dark mountains. Somewhere out there, someone had killed Victor Dalton and let Daniel take the blame. Someone who'd thought themselves clever, thought they'd arranged the perfect crime, but they hadn't counted on a woman from Boston who'd traveled 2,000 miles looking for freedom and found something worth fighting for. They hadn't counted on stubbornness disguised as propriety, on courage hidden beneath Eastern manners, on the fierce determination of someone with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Catherine smiled grimly at her reflection in the dark glass. The trial would come, and she'd be ready. Whatever happened next, she was done being careful. She was done making herself smaller. She'd come west to find out who she could become when no one was telling her who to be. And the answer was turning out to be someone formidable, someone brave, someone who stood beside a man in chains and refused to let convenient lies masquerade as truth. The real fight was just beginning, and for the first time in her life, Catherine Whitmore was ready for it. The week before the trial moved with strange momentum, days that felt simultaneously endless and too short. Catherine worked mornings at the boarding house, scrubbing floors and changing linens alongside Margaret, learning the rhythm of physical labor that left her hands raw but her mind clear. Afternoons she spent with Thomas Fletcher, preparing testimony and going over every detail of the case until the words blurred together. Evenings belonged to Daniel, precious minutes in that dim cell where they talked about everything and nothing, building a foundation from fragments of time, stolen between iron bars. It was during one of these evening visits, 5 days before the trial, that Catherine noticed the change in Daniel's demeanor. He'd been pacing when she arrived, the chains making their familiar metallic song against the stone floor, his expression troubled in a way that went deeper than worry about the upcoming proceedings. Marshal Garrett let her in with his usual gruff nod, retreating to give them what privacy the situation allowed. Daniel stopped pacing when he saw her, but his hands kept moving, restless energy seeking an outlet that didn't exist. "There's something I need to tell you," he said without preamble. "Something I should have written in those letters, but convinced myself didn't matter. That it was buried deep enough to stay dead." Catherine moved closer to the bars, recognizing the particular weight that came with confession. "Whatever it is, I'm listening." Daniel took a breath, then sat heavily on the wooden bench, his head dropping into his hands for a moment before he looked up at her. I told you I came west to build something new, to stake a claim and make a life on my own terms. What I didn't tell you was what I was running from. He'd grown up in Ohio, he explained, the son of a banker who'd built his reputation on conservative lending and careful judgment. Daniel had been expected to follow the same path, to join the family business and perpetuate a legacy of respectability and measured success. Instead, at 23, he'd fallen in love with a woman his family considered unsuitable, Clara Bennett, the daughter of a mill worker, educated beyond her station and openly supportive of labor organizing. His father had forbidden the relationship, using every tool at his disposal to break them apart. When Daniel had refused to comply, his father had used his banking connections to ensure Clara's father lost his job, that their family faced eviction. The doors closed wherever they turned. I thought I could protect her, Daniel said, his voice hollow with old pain. I thought if we just held on, if we proved our love was stronger than his manipulation, he'd eventually give in. Catherine felt her chest tighten, recognizing the shape of tragedy before he spoke it. She got sick that winter, pneumonia. They couldn't afford a doctor, and by the time I found out and brought help, it was too late. She died in a charity hospital while I sat outside her room, turned away by staff who'd been paid to refuse me entrance. His hands clenched and unclenched, the shackles rattling. My father attended her funeral, stood in the back, watching to make sure I saw him, making certain I understood the lesson he was teaching. The silence that followed was heavy with grief, so old it had calcified into the foundation of who Daniel had become. Catherine understood now why he'd written about justice and second chances, why he'd been so careful about honesty in his letters, why the idea of someone using power to destroy the powerless had driven him to fight Dalton, even when pragmatism suggested surrender. I left Ohio the day after Clara's funeral, Daniel continued. Took everything I had and came west, determined to build something my father couldn't touch, to become someone whose worth wasn't measured by family connections or inherited money. I wanted to prove you could make something honest in a world that rewarded dishonesty. And then Victor Dalton showed you that geography doesn't change human nature, Catherine said quietly. That powerful men using their influence to crush those who won't submit isn't unique to Ohio banking families. Daniel's laugh was bitter. Exactly. I thought I'd escaped, but I'd just found the same battle wearing different clothes. When Dalton started his harassment, when he tried to force me off my land through intimidation and legal manipulation, it was like watching my father's tactics replayed with cattle instead of bank loans. He stood, moving to the bars between them. And the worst part? I did exactly what my father always said I'd do. I let emotion override judgment, let stubbornness become recklessness. I should have sold to Dalton, should have taken the money and found land elsewhere. Instead, I dug in, made threats I didn't mean, turned myself into exactly the kind of volatile danger everyone now believes I am. Catherine reached through the bars, taking his face in her hands with a tenderness that made him close his eyes. You're not what your father said you were. You were a man who loved someone and tried to protect her against impossible odds. You were someone who believed principle should matter more than power. Those aren't flaws, Daniel. Those are the reasons I'm standing here instead of on a train back to Boston. He opened his eyes, and she saw tears threatening to fall, years of carried guilt finally finding a witness. But don't you see? My stubbornness got Clara killed, and now it's put you in danger. Roland Dalton isn't going to stop at having me convicted. He's going to come after anyone who's helped me, and that includes you. Let him try, Catherine said firmly. I'm not Clara, trapped by circumstances and dependent on a man to save her. I chose to be here. I chose to fight, and I'm choosing you, not because I need saving, but because we save each other. Daniel's hands came up to cover hers where they still held his face, his touch gentle despite the iron binding his wrists. How are you this brave? How did you travel into the middle of nowhere to marry a stranger, find him accused of murder, and decide that was a challenge worth accepting rather than a disaster worth fleeing? Catherine smiled, though her own eyes were wet now. Because my whole life people told me my mind was impressive but inconvenient, that my questions were unwelcome, that the best I could hope for was a husband who'd tolerate my peculiarities rather than value them. You wrote me letters that treated my intelligence as an asset, my opinions as worth hearing. You offered me partnership instead of patronage. That's not something you walk away from, just because it comes wrapped in complications. She pulled back slightly, keeping her hands on his. And because you trusted me enough to be honest about your past, about your pain, about the ways you've been broken. That's intimacy, Daniel. Not pretending we're perfect, but showing each other the cracks and trusting they won't be used as weapons. He leaned his forehead against the bars, closing the distance between them as much as iron and circumstances allowed. I don't know what I did to deserve you showing up in my life, but I swear to God, Catherine, if I get through this trial, if I get out of these chains, I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me. His voice dropped lower, rough with emotion. I love you. I know that's impossible. We've known each other barely 2 weeks, most of that separated by prison bars. But I loved you before I met you, loved the woman who wrote those letters. And now I love the flesh and blood person who's fierce and stubborn and brave enough to fight battles that aren't hers to fight. Catherine felt something break open in her chest. Not painful, but liberating, like a door she'd kept locked, finally swinging wide. I love you too. And it's not impossible. We've known each other for months through correspondence, shared more honest thoughts than most married couples exchange in years. The letters were real. The person you wrote to was real. And this feeling is real, even if the circumstances are extraordinary. She leaned in, pressing her lips to his through the bars, tasting salt and hope and the particular desperation of two people trying to hold onto something fragile while the world threatened to tear it apart. The kiss was awkward, restricted by iron, but it carried more weight than any choreographed romance ever could. When they pulled apart, Marshal Garrett cleared his throat from his desk in the other room, a gentle reminder that even stolen moments had limits. Daniel kept his hands on hers, unwilling to fully release the connection. 5 more days until the trial. Fletcher thinks we have a chance, with the inconsistencies in the ranch hand's testimony and the evidence about the fraudulent survey. But Catherine, you need to prepare yourself. Even with reasonable doubt, there's no guarantee. Juries out here are unpredictable, and the Daltons have influence that extends into places we can't see. Catherine squeezed his hands. Then we keep fighting until there's nothing left to fight with. But Daniel, I need you to do something for me. He nodded. Anything. Stop carrying your father's judgment. Stop believing that loving someone and losing them makes you responsible for their death. Clara died because the world was cruel and your father was vindictive, not because you weren't enough. She held his gaze, willing him to hear her. And stop trying to protect me from my own choices. I'm here because I want to be. If there are consequences, they're mine to bear, not yours to shoulder on my behalf. Daniel's jaw worked, emotion and resistance warring across his features. That's easier said than done, letting go of guilt I've carried for 12 years. Catherine smiled gently. I know, but maybe start by imagining what Clara would say if she could see you now. Would she want you still punishing yourself, or would she want you to build the life you meant to build together, even if it's with someone else? The question landed heavily, and for a long moment Daniel was silent. Then his shoulders relaxed fractionally, the perpetual tension easing just enough to notice. She'd tell me I was being an idiot. That grief is for honoring people, not entombing yourself with them. He managed a real smile, small but genuine. She'd also probably like you. You're both stubborn enough to argue with walls and expect them to move. Catherine laughed, the sound feeling strange and good in this place designed for despair. Then I'm in good company. They talked longer, the conversation shifting to lighter territory, childhood memories, favorite books, the small details that couldn't fit in letters but mattered in building intimacy. Catherine told him about her father's medical practice, how she'd secretly studied his textbooks and dreamed of becoming a doctor before learning that dream wasn't available to women. Daniel told her about learning to break horses, about the first time he'd felt truly competent at something physical after years of feeling trapped behind a desk. When Marshal Garrett finally announced their time was truly up, Catherine left the cell feeling lighter despite the weight of what lay ahead. She'd seen the man behind the chains now, understood the scars he carried and why they'd shaped him. And he'd seen her, really seen her. Not the proper Boston lady or the brave investigator, but the complete person with all her contradictions and certainties. Walking back to the boarding house through the cooling evening, Catherine passed the saloon where light and music spilled into the street. Men's voices rose in laughter. Someone played a piano badly but enthusiastically, and for a moment she glimpsed the ordinary life that existed alongside tragedy. People still ate and drank and found joy even when justice hung in the balance. The world didn't stop for individual suffering. Margaret was waiting in the kitchen when Catherine returned, a pot of tea already prepared. "Sit," she said without preamble. "You look like you've been wrung out and hung to dry." Catherine sat gratefully, accepting the cup of tea and wrapping her hands around its warmth. "Daniel told me about his past tonight, about the woman he loved before, about why he came west." Margaret nodded knowingly. "Figured that story would come out eventually. Man carries that kind of pain. It seeps through no matter how well you think you've buried it." She poured her own tea, settling into the chair across from Catherine. "Does it change how you feel about him?" Catherine considered the question seriously. "No. If anything, it makes me more certain. He's not some naive romantic who thinks love conquers all. He's someone who knows exactly how brutal the world can be and still chooses to believe in building something honest. That takes more courage than optimism ever did." Margaret smiled, the expression softening her weathered features. "You're good for him. And I think maybe he's good for you too. Gives you something worth fighting for that's bigger than just escaping a life you didn't want." Catherine sipped her tea, acknowledging the truth in that observation. "I came west looking for freedom. I'm finding out freedom isn't just absence of constraint. It's having something you'd fight to protect." The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Thomas Fletcher worked late into each night, refining their defense strategy, preparing questions for witnesses, trying to anticipate the prosecution's moves. Catherine helped where she could, her education proving useful in researching territorial law and constructing logical arguments. James Caldwell kept the ranch running, despite mounting pressure from Dalton employees who'd begun making life difficult for Daniel's hired man. Fences were cut, cattle scattered, supplies mysteriously disappeared. Roland Dalton was sending a message. Cooperation with Daniel's defense would have consequences. 2 days before the trial, Catherine received an unexpected visitor. She was hanging laundry behind the boarding house when a woman approached, perhaps 40 years old, dressed simply but with an air of quiet dignity. "Miss Whitmore, I'm Helen Garrett, the marshal's wife. Might I have a word?" Catherine set down the wet shirt she'd been wringing out, surprised but curious. "Of course." They sat on the back steps, and Helen was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "My husband doesn't talk much about his work, but I've been watching him these past weeks. He's troubled by this case more than usual. The inconsistencies you found, the questions you've been asking, they've made him doubt the easy answer he was ready to accept." Catherine felt hope stir. "Does he think Daniel is innocent?" Helen shook her head slowly. "He thinks the truth is more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. That's not the same as innocence, but it's not guilt either. He's going to testify about the inconsistencies in the ranch hand's statements, and he's going to be honest about the timeline problems. It won't be enough on its own, but combined with everything else." She trailed off, then added, "I wanted you to know that not everyone in this town has made up their minds. Some of us still believe in asking hard questions." After Helen left, Catherine stood in the afternoon sun, feeling something precious and fragile, possibility. The trial would determine Daniel's fate, but at least now there would be genuine examination rather than predetermined conclusion. That evening's visit with Daniel was different, lighter somehow, despite the approaching judgment. They talked about the future they wanted to build. The ranch expanded with a proper house instead of the cabin that currently stood. Children someday running through fields that stretched to the mountains. A life measured in seasons and growth rather than society's narrow definitions of success. It was fantasy, maybe, dependent on outcomes they couldn't control. But it felt necessary to imagine the other side of this darkness. "When we're married," Daniel said, his tone deliberately casual despite the weight of assumption, "I want you to have equal say in every decision about the ranch. Not consultation or consideration, but actual partnership where your vote counts as much as mine." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "When are we married?" "That's quite presumptuous for a man currently in shackles awaiting trial." He grinned, and she saw glimpses of who he must have been before grief and conflict had hardened him. "I'm choosing optimism over realism. Besides, you're the one who told me to stop carrying guilt and start building forward." "I'm taking your advice." Catherine moved close to the bars, her voice dropping to something intimate despite their lack of privacy. "Then yes, when we're married, I want partnership. I want to build something that proves two people working together are stronger than either standing alone. I want to wake up every morning and choose you again, not out of obligation, but because you make me braver than I knew I could be." Daniel's hand reached through to touch her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "3 more days. Then we face this together, whatever comes." She turned her face into his touch. "Whatever comes," she echoed. "But Daniel, I'm not preparing for failure. I'm preparing to win, and then I'm preparing to spend the rest of my life reminding you that choosing courage over fear was always the right answer." That night, Catherine lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the wind move through the eaves and thinking about everything that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she'd been sitting in a Boston library, feeling like life was happening to everyone except her. Now she was in Wyoming, preparing to testify at a murder trial, in love with a man facing possible execution, and more alive than she'd ever been. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd come west looking for freedom, and found it in fighting for someone else's. But maybe that was what freedom actually meant. Not absence of obligation, but the ability to choose your obligations, to decide what mattered enough to risk everything defending. The morning before the trial, Catherine visited the small church at the edge of town, not because she was particularly religious, but because she needed a space designed for reflection. She sat in the empty building, light filtering through simple windows, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what lay ahead. Tomorrow, Daniel's life would be weighed by 12 people who barely knew him, judged by standards that had more to do with convenience than justice. She'd done everything she could to create reasonable doubt, to expose the weaknesses in the prosecution's case. Now she had to trust that truth was stubborn enough to push through, even when power wanted it buried. She thought of her father, dead 9 years now, and imagined what he'd say if he could see her. He'd be proud, she thought. He'd raised her to think critically, to question assumptions, to believe that intelligence was meant to be used rather than hidden. He'd taught her that courage wasn't absence of fear, but acting despite it. And he'd told her, in those last weeks before pneumonia took him, that the only life worth living was one where you mattered, where your actions created ripples that extended beyond yourself. "I'm creating ripples. Papa," she whispered to the empty church, "I just hope they're strong enough to carry us through." Outside, Blackwater prepared for the spectacle to come. The trial would draw crowds from surrounding ranches, people hungry for drama and resolution. The territorial judge was already in town, reviewing documents in the hotel's best room. Thomas Fletcher was making final preparations, his young face drawn with the pressure of a case that would define his early career. And in the marshal's office, Daniel Merrick sat in chains, trusting a woman he'd known for 2 weeks to help save his life. The story should have been impossible. The mail-order bride meets the accused murderer and decides to fight for his innocence, despite all evidence and social pressure to abandon him. But impossibility Catherine was learning, was just another word for a challenge no one had been brave enough to accept yet. Tomorrow, the trial would begin. Tomorrow, they'd stand before judgment and demand it actually look at the truth instead of taking easy answers. Tomorrow would determine whether love built through letters and forged in crisis was strong enough to survive the weight of frontier justice. But tonight, Catherine simply sat in the quiet church and gathered her strength. Preparing for the fight of her life, the makeshift courtroom was packed beyond capacity, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder in the town hall that doubled as church and meeting space. Catherine sat in the front row behind Thomas Fletcher's table, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling, watching as Daniel was led in wearing fresh clothes, but still shackled at the wrists and ankles. His eyes found hers immediately, and she gave him the smallest nod, courage borrowed and returned in a single gesture. Judge Harper took his seat behind a table that served as the bench, his weathered face revealing nothing as he surveyed the crowd with the weary authority of a man who'd seen every variation of human weakness. The prosecutor was a territorial attorney named Benjamin Cross, a sharp-featured man in his 50s who'd built his reputation on conviction rates rather than pursuit of truth. He laid out the case with practiced efficiency. Daniel Merrick had publicly threatened Victor Dalton, had motive to kill him over the water rights dispute, and had been found standing over the body with the murder weapon in his hands. 3 witnesses would testify to the threat. 2 would confirm finding him at the scene, and physical evidence would establish opportunity and means. It was neat, compelling, the kind of straightforward narrative juries preferred to complicated alternatives. Thomas Fletcher's opening was quieter, but no less determined. He spoke of reasonable doubt, of inconsistencies in witness testimony, of evidence suggesting Daniel had been set up by someone who'd counted on circumstantial appearances overwhelming actual investigation. Catherine watched the jury, 12 men ranging from ranchers to shopkeepers, their faces betraying varying degrees of skepticism and interest. Roland Dalton sat in the front row opposite Catherine, his expression carved from stone, radiating certainty that justice would align with his interests as it always had. The prosecution's case unfolded over the morning. Fletcher, the storekeeper, testified to hearing Daniel threaten Dalton, describing the confrontation with embellishments that made Daniel sound unhinged rather than merely angry. 2 other witnesses confirmed similar accounts, though Fletcher managed to expose inconsistencies in their descriptions of exactly what had been said. Then came Frank Sutton, the older ranch hand, his tobacco-stained fingers gripping the witness chair as he recounted finding Daniel at the crime scene. "He was standing over Mr. Dalton with the rifle in his hands," Sutton said, his voice steady with rehearsed certainty. Mr. Dalton was already dead, and Merrick had this look on his face, satisfaction, like he'd finally done what he'd been threatening to do for months. Fletcher rose for cross-examination, his youth no longer seeming like a disadvantage. "Mr. Sutton, you testified you and Mr. Morgan were working in the south pasture when you heard the shot. How far is that from the canyon where Victor Dalton died?" Sutton shifted slightly. "Maybe 2 miles, give or take." Fletcher pulled out a map, approaching the jury. 2 miles across rough terrain. Yet you arrived at the scene within minutes of the shot being fired. How did you cover that distance so quickly? Sutton's jaw tightened. "We rode hard when we heard the gunshot. Knew something was wrong." Fletcher nodded thoughtfully. "You rode hard together, but according to the work schedule from the Dalton ranch, you and Mr. Morgan were supposed to be working separate sections that day. Why were you together?" The question landed in sudden silence, and Catherine saw Sutton's confidence flicker. "Plans changed. Morgan's section was done early, so he joined me." Fletcher pressed forward. "Who authorized that change? Who told Mr. Morgan to join you instead of continuing with his assigned work?" Sutton glanced toward Roland Dalton, a split-second tell that several jurors noticed. "Don't recall exactly. Things change on a working ranch." Fletcher let the evasion hang in the air before continuing. "Mr. Sutton, do you smoke?" The question seemed to throw Sutton off balance. "What's that got to do with anything?" Judge Harper intervened. "Answer the question, Mr. Sutton." Sutton's expression hardened. Yeah, I smoke. So what? Fletcher produced the cigarette end Catherine had found, now entered as evidence. This was discovered on a ridge overlooking the crime scene, positioned perfectly to observe everything that happened in the canyon below. It appears to be relatively fresh, probably left within days of the murder. Can you explain how it got there? Sutton's face flushed. Could be from anyone. I check that ridge sometimes, looking for stray cattle. Could have dropped it weeks ago. Fletcher's voice remained calm, but insistent. Yet you didn't mention checking that ridge in your initial testimony. You said you were working the south pasture. The ridge overlooks the canyon. That's north of your assigned area. So which is it, Mr. Sutton? Were you working where you said, or were you somewhere you haven't admitted? The prosecutor objected, arguing speculation, but Judge Harper overruled him. The witness will answer. Sutton's hands gripped the chair arms. I might have checked the ridge that morning. Don't remember exactly. Like I said, things change on a working ranch. But the damage was done. His certainty had cracked, his story had shifted, and the jury had seen it. Pete Morgan's testimony followed, and Fletcher systematically exposed more inconsistencies. The time they'd arrived at the scene varied by several minutes between the two accounts. The exact position they'd found Daniel standing had changed. Small details that separately might mean nothing, but together suggested stories rehearsed imperfectly, narratives constructed rather than remembered. When Marshal Garrett took the stand, Catherine held her breath. The prosecutor had him confirm the basic facts. Daniel found at the scene, rifle in hand, victim already dead. But Fletcher's cross-examination drew out the doubts. Marshal, in your initial report, you noted that the murder weapon showed signs of having been recently fired. How recently? Garrett consulted his notes. Barrel was still warm, powder residue fresh. I'd estimate within 15 to 20 minutes of when I examined it. Fletcher nodded. And when did you arrive at the scene relative to when the ranch hands discovered Mr. Merrick? Garrett's expression was carefully neutral. Approximately 30 minutes after, based on when they sent word and how long it took me to ride out. So the rifle was fired 15 to 20 minutes before you examined it, which was 30 minutes after the discovery. That means the shot was fired roughly 45 to 50 minutes before you arrived. Fletcher paused, letting the jury follow the timeline. Mr. Merrick testified he heard the shot, rode to the scene, and was discovered by the ranch hands within 10 minutes total. If that's accurate, what does that tell you about when Victor Dalton was actually killed? Garrett's jaw worked, reluctance clear in his posture. It suggests a longer gap between the shooting and the discovery than what makes sense if Merrick fired the shot himself. Unless the gun was fired earlier and sat warming in the sun, which seems unlikely given the temperature that day. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Judge Harper gavelled for silence. Fletcher pressed his advantage. Marshal, did you find gunpowder residue on Mr. Merrick's hands when you arrested him? Garrett shook his head slowly. No, but he could have wiped his hands clean. Fletcher's voice sharpened. Could have. But you didn't find any evidence he had. No cloth with residue, no indication he'd washed his hands. In fact, your report notes his hands were dirty from ranch work, but showed no signs of recent cleaning. Isn't that correct? Garrett nodded reluctantly. That's correct. The admission rippled through the room, and Catherine saw several jurors leaning forward, doubt replacing certainty. The defense case began after lunch. James Caldwell testified to Daniel's character, to his intelligence and self-control, to the implausibility that he'd killed someone messily when he'd been on the verge of winning legally. Thomas Fletcher, the lawyer, presented the evidence of the fraudulent survey, explaining in meticulous detail how Victor Dalton had been willing to commit fraud to steal water rights, and how Daniel had discovered this fraud and was preparing to expose it at the hearing. Daniel Merrick had no motive to kill Victor Dalton, Fletcher argued. He was going to defeat him legitimately, publicly, in a way that would have destroyed Dalton's reputation and legal claim. Murder would only jeopardize that victory. Then Catherine took the stand, her heart hammering but her voice steady. She described finding the cigarette evidence, explained the timeline inconsistencies she'd noticed, detailed the threatening behavior from Roland Dalton when she'd investigated. The prosecutor tried to discredit her during cross-examination, painting her as a love-struck woman willing to invent conspiracies to save her intended husband. "Miss Whitmore, isn't it true you traveled here specifically to marry the defendant? That you have a vested interest in his acquittal?" Catherine met his gaze directly. "I have an interest in truth, Mr. Cross. Whether that leads to acquittal or conviction is for the jury to decide based on evidence, not emotion." The prosecution tried to regain ground with their closing argument, emphasizing the physical facts Daniel found with the weapon, his public threats, his obvious motive despite the survey evidence. But Fletcher's closing was devastating in its simplicity. "The prosecution has given you a story that's neat and easy, but easy isn't the same as true. The evidence shows Daniel Merrick was found at a crime scene he'd ridden to after hearing a shot. The evidence shows two ranch hands who changed their story multiple times, who were working together when they shouldn't have been, who arrived suspiciously fast at a remote location. The evidence shows a timeline that doesn't match the prosecution's narrative. And the evidence shows that Daniel Merrick, a man accused of losing control and committing murder, somehow did so without getting gunpowder residue on his hands. That's not a minor detail. That's reasonable doubt, written in facts the prosecution can't explain away. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, time that stretched like days. Catherine sat on the courthouse steps with James and Margaret, unable to eat or speak, simply waiting while Daniel's fate hung in the balance. When the bell finally rang, calling everyone back inside, her legs barely carried her. Daniel was brought in, his face pale but composed, his eyes finding hers and holding on like she was the only solid thing in a world gone fluid. The jury foreman stood, a rancher named Cooper who'd listened intently throughout the trial. Judge Harper's voice cut through the silence. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Cooper cleared his throat. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of murder, we find the defendant not guilty." The courtroom exploded into noise, gasps, shouts, Roland Dalton's roar of protest lost in the chaos. Catherine couldn't breathe, couldn't move, could only watch as Marshal Garrett moved to unlock Daniel's shackles, as the iron fell away from his wrists and ankles, as he stood free for the first time in weeks. His eyes were wet, his hands shaking as he rubbed the marks the chains had left. Judge Harper gavelled for order. "Mr. Merrick, you're free to go. This court is adjourned." Then Daniel was moving toward her, and Catherine was running, and they met in an embrace that felt like coming home after years of exile. He lifted her off her feet, his face buried in her hair, both of them crying and laughing simultaneously. "You did it," he whispered against her ear. "You actually did it." Catherine pulled back just enough to see his face, to touch him without bars between them. "We did it, all of us." Around them, people were filing out, some congratulating them, others leaving in angry silence. Roland Dalton stopped as he passed, his voice low and venomous. "This isn't over. My father's killer is still out there, and I'll find them." He looked at Catherine with undisguised hatred. "And when I do, everyone who helped Merrick will answer for obstructing justice." Daniel stepped in front of Catherine protectively, but she moved beside him instead. "Then I suggest you start investigating honestly instead of accepting convenient answers. Truth doesn't care about your family's power." Outside, the afternoon sun felt different somehow, brighter and warmer, like the world had been waiting for this moment to properly arrive. James approached, grinning wider than Catherine had seen since meeting him. "We're having dinner at the boarding house tonight. Margaret's insisting, and I'm not arguing with her." Daniel's arm stayed around Catherine's waist, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. "We'll be there. But first I need to see my ranch. Need to remember what I was fighting for." They rode out together, Daniel on his own horse for the first time in weeks, Catherine beside him with James following at a respectful distance. The land spread before them in rolling hills and distant mountains, grass turning gold with autumn, the creek running silver through the valley. The ranch was modest, a cabin that needed work, a barn that had seen better days, corrals that James had maintained despite the harassment. But to Daniel it was everything. He dismounted and just stood there, looking at the land he'd nearly lost, the future that had almost been stolen. Catherine came to stand beside him, her hand finding his. "It's beautiful," she said simply. Daniel turned to her, his expression full of things words couldn't capture. "I want to build a real house here, big enough for a family. I want to wake up every morning and choose this life, choose you, choose the work of building something that matters." Catherine smiled, her own future suddenly clear in a way it never had been in Boston. "Then let's build it, together." The dinner at Margaret's boarding house that evening was a celebration that felt earned rather than assumed. James regaled them with stories from the trial, imitating the prosecutor's increasingly frustrated expressions, making even Margaret laugh. Thomas Fletcher joined them, still stunned by his first major victory, already worrying about what cases he'd take next. The food was simple: roasted chicken, vegetables from Margaret's garden, bread that Catherine had helped bake that morning. But it tasted like freedom, like possibility, like the beginning of something they'd fought hard enough to deserve. Later, as the evening cooled and others drifted away, Daniel and Catherine walked through Blackwater's quiet streets, no destination in mind, just wanting to exist together without walls or witnesses or weapons defining their space. They ended up back at the church where Catherine had sat the night before, and without discussing it, they went inside. The small building was dark, except for moonlight through the windows, peaceful in a way that felt deliberate. "Catherine Whitmore," Daniel said, taking both her hands in his voice steady despite the emotion underneath. "I know this isn't how either of us imagined this moment. I don't have a ring, don't have pretty words prepared, don't have anything except the absolute certainty that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me? Properly, with witnesses and vows, with nothing between us except the promises we're choosing to make." Catherine felt tears slip down her cheeks, the good kind that came from joy, too big to contain. "Yes, absolutely yes. Tomorrow if possible, next week if necessary, but yes." They kissed in that empty church, unhurried and deep, tasting the salt of tears and the sweetness of surviving impossible odds. When they finally pulled apart, Catherine laughed softly. "Your proposal in the jail cell was better. You included specifics about partnership and equal decision-making." Daniel grinned, the expression transforming him into someone younger, lighter, the man he might have been without grief and chains. "Consider those terms incorporated by reference. Everything I said then stands, except now I can actually follow through." They married 3 days later in that same church, with Margaret and James as witnesses, Judge Harper officiating in his capacity as territorial justice, and half of Blackwater watching with varying degrees of approval and scandal. Catherine wore a simple blue dress Margaret had helped her alter, and Daniel wore clean work clothes that James had pressed with surprising care. The vows were traditional, but felt revolutionary, two people who'd met under the worst circumstances, choosing each other anyway, building a foundation from letters and trust, and the stubborn refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. When Judge Harper pronounced them married, the kiss they shared was witnessed by a community still processing the trial, still uncertain whether to celebrate or condemn. The ranch became theirs, legally, emotionally, practically. Catherine threw herself into learning the rhythms of ranch life with the same intensity she'd applied to investigating the murder. She learned to ride properly, to help with cattle, to manage accounts and supplies. Daniel taught her patiently, treating her questions as valuable rather than burdensome, and slowly the ranch began to feel less like foreign territory and more like home. They worked side by side, building fence lines and planning expansions, making decisions together about which cattle to sell and when to plant hay. In the evenings, they'd sit on the cabin's porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, talking about everything and nothing, building intimacy from accumulated moments. James stayed on as partner rather than hired help. Daniel insisting on sharing profits now that Catherine had brought her inheritance money into the operation. They hired 2 more hands, men willing to work for someone the Daltons considered an enemy, and slowly the ranch began to thrive. Word spread about the trial, about Catherine's investigation and Fletcher's skilled defense, and people began to view Daniel differently, not as a volatile troublemaker, but as someone who'd been targeted by power and survived. It didn't win everyone over. The Daltons still commanded significant influence, and there were those who would always believe Daniel had somehow escaped justice. But enough minds changed that the ranch could operate without constant sabotage, that Catherine could walk through town without facing open hostility. One evening, about a month after the wedding, Catherine was preparing dinner when Daniel came in carrying something wrapped in cloth. "I made you something," he said, almost shy. "It's not much, but I wanted you to have it." She unwrapped the cloth to find a wooden box, beautifully crafted with dovetail joints and a fitted lid. Inside, carefully arranged, were all the letters they'd written to each other, preserved and protected. "I know we're building new memories now," Daniel said, "but I didn't want to lose the ones that brought us here. These letters saved me before I ever met you. And then they saved me again, when you arrived and fought for the man who'd written them." Catherine set the box down carefully and wrapped her arms around him, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Thank you for keeping them, for remembering, for being exactly who you promised you were." They stood like that in the cabin's warm light, 2 people who'd found each other across impossible distances, who'd survived accusations and trials and the weight of other people's certainty. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved through the grass, and somewhere in the hills, coyotes called to each other, their voices carrying stories of survival and persistence. Inside, Catherine and Daniel began building the life they'd imagined in letters written when hope was all they had. It wasn't the fairy tale ending, where everything became perfect. The ranch required hard work, winters were brutal, and the shadow of Victor Dalton's unsolved murder still hung over them. But it was theirs, built on honesty and partnership, on choosing each other repeatedly despite easier alternatives. And in the growing darkness broken by candlelight, in these small domestic moments of shared meals and quiet conversation, they discovered that happiness wasn't the absence of struggle, but the presence of someone worth struggling alongside. The worst was behind them, though they didn't know it yet. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer terrifying, because they'd already survived the hardest test, finding each other and refusing to let circumstances break what they'd built from nothing but words and faith. Winter arrived early that year, the first snow falling in mid-November and blanketing the ranch in white silence that muffled the world beyond their valley. Catherine stood at the cabin window, watching dawn break over the mountains, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, feeling the life growing inside her with a certainty that preceded any physical confirmation. She hadn't told Daniel yet, wanted to be absolutely sure before sharing news that would change everything again. Behind her, she heard him stirring, the creak of the bed followed by his footsteps crossing the wooden floor. His arms wrapped around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder as they watched the sun paint the snow in shades of rose and gold. "What are you thinking about?" he asked quietly, his voice still rough with sleep. Catherine leaned back into his warmth. "About how far we've come. About how different this is from what I imagined when I boarded that train in Boston." Daniel's arms tightened slightly. "Better or worse?" She turned in his embrace, looking up at him with a smile that held both certainty and wonder. "So much better than I could have imagined. Even with everything we've been through, everything we've survived, especially because of all that. We earned this." The peace they'd built over the past months felt fragile some days, like something that could shatter if they weren't vigilant in protecting it. Roland Dalton hadn't given up his vendetta, though he'd been forced to pursue it through legal harassment rather than direct confrontation. He'd challenged their water rights, filed complaints about their cattle crossing onto disputed land, used every bureaucratic tool available to make their lives difficult. But they'd learned to fight those battles, Catherine's education proving invaluable in navigating territorial law. Daniel's stubbornness ensuring they never surrendered ground without reason. James had become more than an employee. He was family, living in the newly built bunkhouse and taking genuine pride in the ranch's success. That morning, as they worked together feeding cattle and breaking ice on water troughs, a rider appeared on the eastern ridge. Catherine recognized Marshal Garrett's distinctive posture before she could make out his face, and something in the way he sat. His horse suggested this wasn't a social visit. Daniel saw him too, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle they now kept in the barn, old habits dying hard. But Garrett raised his hand in greeting as he approached, his expression more troubled than threatening. "Mr. and Mrs. Merrick," he said, dismounting. "I need to talk to you both. It's about Victor Dalton's murder." They gathered in the cabin, Catherine putting coffee on, while the marshal settled himself at their table, his weathered hands wrapped around the cup she offered. "I've been investigating quietly since the trial," he began without preamble. "The verdict troubled me, not because I thought it was wrong, but because it meant the real killer was still out there. I couldn't let that stand, even if it meant contradicting the conclusions I'd initially accepted." He pulled out a notebook, pages filled with careful observations. "I started by re-examining the crime scene, looking for anything we'd missed in the rush to arrest Daniel. Found something interesting. A second set of boot prints, partially obscured by the traffic from that day, leading away from the body toward the eastern ridge." Daniel leaned forward, his attention absolute. "Whose prints?" Garrett shook his head. Couldn't tell definitively, but the size and tread suggested someone lighter than Frank Sutton, heavier than Pete Morgan. Someone who'd been standing in a specific position that gave them a clear shot at Dalton, but kept them hidden from the main approach. He flipped a page. "Then I started asking questions about who benefited from Dalton's death, beyond the obvious answers. Victor's will left everything to Roland, but it also included provisions. The ranch couldn't be sold or significantly altered for 5 years after Victor's death. He'd built that empire from nothing and wanted to make sure his son didn't squander it impulsively." Catherine felt pieces shifting in her mind, patterns emerging from information that had seemed disconnected. Roland wanted to expand faster than his father allowed. They'd been arguing about it. "You're suggesting Roland killed his own father to gain control without those restrictions?" Garrett's expression was grim. "I'm suggesting it's possible, but I couldn't prove it, not until 3 days ago when Frank Sutton showed up at my office. Drunk and guilt-ridden, ready to confess everything." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the wind against the cabin walls and the crackling of the fire. Garrett consulted his notes, though Catherine suspected he'd memorized every word. According to Sutton, Roland had been planning it for weeks. He knew about the water rights hearing, knew his father was likely to lose, and that the loss would weaken the ranch's position. But more than that, he was tired of being controlled, tired of waiting for an inheritance he believed should already be his. He approached Sutton and Morgan, offered them money and guaranteed employment, and laid out the plan. They'd kill Victor and make sure Daniel Merrick took the blame. Catherine's hand found Daniel's under the table, gripping tight as they listened to the marshal describe how carefully Roland had orchestrated everything. The day of the murder, Roland had lured his father to the canyon under the pretense of checking fence lines, knowing Daniel would be working nearby. Sutton and Morgan had positioned themselves on the ridge, watching, waiting. When Victor arrived, Roland had confronted him one final time about the expansion plans, about loosening control. When Victor refused, Roland had shot him with Daniel's rifle, stolen from the ranch weeks earlier during one of the harassment incidents. Roland had then hidden while Sutton and Morgan scrambled down from the ridge, arriving just as Daniel came riding up after hearing the shot. The setup had been nearly perfect, counting on Daniel's known anger toward Victor to provide motive, his presence at the scene to provide opportunity, and the community's readiness to believe the worst about someone who challenged powerful men. "Why is Sutton confessing now?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with controlled rage. Garrett's expression turned sad. Guilt. Morgan died last week. Horse fell on him during a storm, crushed his chest before anyone could help. Sutton took it as divine judgment, convinced God was punishing them for what they'd done. He came to me sobbing, said he couldn't live with the weight anymore, needed to confess before he ended up dead too. The marshal looked at them both directly. I arrested Roland yesterday. He's in custody now, denying everything, claiming Sutton's lying to save himself. But Sutton provided details only the killer would know. Where Roland hid after the shooting, how they'd practiced the timing, where the money was hidden that Roland had paid them. Catherine felt vindication and horror warring in her chest. Will it hold up in court? Or will Roland's money and influence let him escape justice like his father would have? Garrett's jaw tightened. Judge Harper's taking this case personally. He doesn't like being played for a fool. And he doesn't like powerful families thinking they're above territorial law. The trial's set for January, and he's bringing in a prosecutor from Denver who has no connections to the Daltons. It won't be easy, but I think we've got him. Daniel stood abruptly, moving to the window, his shoulders rigid with tension. All those weeks I spent in chains. All the fear, the certainty I'd hang for something I didn't do. And it was Roland all along, standing in that courtroom watching, probably laughing inside at how perfectly his plan had worked. Catherine went to him, her hand on his back, feeling the tremors of rage and relief and residual trauma. But it didn't work. You're here free with a life that's yours. Roland will face judgment, and this time the truth won't be buried by convenience or power. Daniel turned, pulling her close, his voice rough against her hair. Because of you. If you hadn't come, hadn't investigated, hadn't refused to accept easy answers, I'd be dead, and Roland would have inherited everything without anyone questioning it. Garrett cleared his throat gently. Miss Catherine did what needed doing. But Daniel, you should know, the trial won't require your testimony unless you want to give it. Sutton's confession is detailed enough that the prosecution can proceed without forcing you to relive it all. Daniel shook his head firmly. I'll testify. I want to look Roland in the eye and tell the jury exactly what he put me through, what he put Catherine through. I want my voice on the record so everyone knows what happens when powerful men think they can sacrifice others to serve their ambitions. Garrett nodded, unsurprised. Figured you'd say that. I'll let Fletcher know. He's assisting with the prosecution this time. After the marshal left, Catherine and Daniel stood together in their cabin, processing the news that changed everything and nothing. The truth was finally emerging. Justice might actually prevail, but it didn't erase the weeks Daniel had spent in chains or the fear that had colored their early days together. We need to talk, Catherine said softly, taking his hand and leading him to sit beside her. About something else, something good. She watched his face as she told him about the life growing inside her, about the certainty she felt despite being only 6 weeks along, about the future that suddenly felt more tangible than ever before. Daniel's expression transformed through shock, wonder, and joy so pure it brought tears to his eyes. A child, he whispered, his hand moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. We're going to have a child. Catherine covered his hand with hers. Are you ready for this? I know we've barely had time to adjust to being married, and now... He silenced her with a kiss, gentle and reverent. I've been ready since I first read your letters and realized there were people in this world who thought like you, who wanted what you wanted. A family, a real one, built on choice and honesty and love that doesn't come with conditions. The months that followed were filled with preparations both legal and personal. Roland Dalton's trial proceeded through winter, the evidence mounting against him despite his expensive lawyers and political connections. Sutton testified in exchange for a reduced sentence, describing in devastating detail how Roland had planned and executed his father's murder. The prosecution presented the stolen rifle, the financial records showing payments to Sutton and Morgan, witness testimony about Roland's arguments with his father over control of the ranch. Daniel took the stand and spoke with quiet intensity about being framed. about the terror of facing execution for a crime he hadn't committed, about the systematic way Roland had dismantled his life to serve a murderous ambition. The verdict came in late February, guilty on all counts. Roland Dalton was sentenced to hang, though he'd likely spend years exhausting appeals before that sentence was carried out. For Catherine and Daniel, the verdict brought closure they hadn't realized they needed. The shadow that had hung over their marriage lifted, replaced by certainty that the truth had finally won, despite every advantage Roland had possessed. In the courtroom, as the sentence was read, Catherine felt Daniel's hand tighten on hers. And when they walked out into the cold winter air, his smile was genuine and unguarded for the first time since she'd met him. Spring arrived with the abrupt enthusiasm that characterized Wyoming seasons. Snow melting into rivers that fed the creek, grass emerging green and vital from the dormant earth. Catherine's pregnancy became visible, her body changing in ways that felt miraculous and strange. The community's attitude toward them shifted as well. Vindication in Roland's conviction translated into grudging respect for the couple who'd refused to accept injustice. Women who'd previously avoided Catherine began stopping to chat, offering advice about pregnancy and childbirth. Men who'd watched Daniel warily now greeted him by name, acknowledging that he'd been wronged and had survived with dignity and tact. The ranch thrived as well. They'd use Catherine's remaining inheritance to purchase additional cattle and improve the infrastructure, building a proper barn and expanding the cabin into something that could genuinely be called a house. James had courted and married Margaret's niece, a practical woman named Ruth, who'd come west seeking her own new beginning. The four of them became a unit, working the ranch together, sharing meals and plans, and the easy companionship that came from shared purpose. On warm evenings, they'd gather on the porch Daniel had built, watching the sunset and telling stories about the day, building the kind of community they'd all been searching for without knowing it. In early June, Catherine went into labor during an afternoon thunderstorm, the sky unleashing fury while she brought new life into the world. Daniel stayed beside her throughout, his hand crushed in hers, his voice steady even when fear threatened to overwhelm them both. Margaret and Ruth assisted with the practiced competence of women who'd done this before. And when the baby finally arrived, a girl with Daniel's dark hair and Catherine's determined expression, the room filled with the sound of her angry, vital crying. Daniel held his daughter with a tenderness that made Catherine's heart ache, his large hands careful with the fragile bundle, his eyes wet with tears he didn't bother hiding. "What should we name her?" he asked softly, looking from the baby to Catherine with an expression of complete awe. Catherine had been thinking about this for months, about names that honored the past while embracing the future. "Clara," she said finally. "Clara Grace Merrick. For the woman you loved first, so she knows that love doesn't diminish with sharing. It just grows to encompass more." Daniel's face crumpled briefly, grief and gratitude mingling into something that transcended words. "She would have loved that. She would have loved you." He leaned down, kissing Catherine's forehead. "Thank you. For understanding, for being brave enough to honor her memory instead of competing with it." They built their life around Clara, the ranch operating around the rhythms of her needs and their growing confidence as parents. Catherine discovered that motherhood suited her in unexpected ways. She approached it with the same analytical curiosity she'd brought to investigating the murder, reading everything she could find about child development while also trusting her instincts about what this particular child needed. Daniel was hands-on in ways that surprised neighbors accustomed to fathers who kept distance from infant care, changing diapers and walking the floor during colicky nights with the same dedication he brought to maintaining fence lines. One evening in late summer, when Clara was 3 months old and sleeping peacefully in the cradle Daniel had built, Catherine and Daniel stood on their porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The air was still warm, carrying the scent of sage and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. "Do you ever think about Boston?" Daniel asked, his arm around her waist, his voice curious rather than worried. Catherine considered the question seriously. Sometimes. I think about my sister, hope she's well. Wonder what my mother tells people about where I went. She leaned into him. But I don't miss it. That life was like wearing clothes that didn't fit, technically functional, but constantly uncomfortable. Daniel was quiet for a moment. I used to dream about Clara, about the life we might have had if my father hadn't destroyed it. Used to think happiness was something that happened once, and if you lost it, you were done. He turned Catherine to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. You taught me that's not true. That happiness isn't a single event, but a series of choices, of moments where you decide what matters and build toward it. Every morning I wake up next to you, every time I hold our daughter. Every day we work this ranch together. Those are choices to keep building, to keep choosing this life. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind that came from being fully seen and completely loved. In my letters, she said softly, I told you I wanted a life where I mattered, where my thoughts counted for something beyond decoration. You've given me that, but more than that, we've built it together. I'm not just your wife who happens to be smart. I'm your partner who helps run this ranch, who investigated a murder, who brings her full self to everything we do. That's the life I dreamed about but didn't quite believe was possible. Daniel pulled her close, and they stood like that as darkness completed its claim on the day. Two people who'd found each other through the unlikeliest circumstances and built something strong enough to weather every test. The following spring, they received a letter from Boston. Rebecca had married, and her wedding portrait showed a woman glowing with happiness, standing beside a young professor who taught literature and apparently valued sharp minds in his wife. The letter described how Rebecca had told her new husband all about her adventurous sister who'd gone west to marry a rancher and ended up solving a murder. He thinks you're magnificent, Rebecca wrote, and Mother has finally stopped mentioning you in tones of scandal and started hinting that perhaps you knew what you were doing all along. It's the closest she'll ever come to admitting she was wrong. Catherine showed the letter to Daniel, who smiled at the vindication Catherine had never needed, but appreciated anyway. They hosted their first real gathering that summer. Neighbors from surrounding ranches, townspeople who'd witnessed their journey from scandal to respect, James and Ruth with their infant son, Thomas Fletcher and his new bride. The house Daniel had built was large enough now to accommodate the crowd, though most spilled onto the porch and into the yard, children running wild while adults talked and laughed. Catherine moved through the gathering feeling a contentment so profound it was almost frightening. Aware that this was the life she'd been reaching for on that train platform in Boston, the belonging she'd hoped might exist if she was brave enough to search for it. As evening settled and guests began to depart, Catherine found herself standing near the creek with Clara balanced on her hip, watching Daniel repair a fence section with the same careful attention he brought to everything he valued. He looked up, caught her watching and smiled, not the guarded expression she'd first seen through prison bars, but something open and undefended, the face of a man who'd learned to trust happiness again. "What are you thinking?" he called over. Catherine shifted Clara to her other hip. "That I made the right choice. Every single impossible, terrifying choice, from boarding that train to investigating your case, to staying when everyone said I should leave. All of it was right." Daniel set down his tools and walked over, his hand coming up to cup Clara's head with automatic gentleness before pulling Catherine into an embrace that included them both. "I used to think freedom meant being left alone, not having anyone who could hurt you. But real freedom is choosing your obligations, deciding what's worth the risk of losing." He looked at her seriously. "You're worth every risk. This life is worth every fight we've had to wage to protect it." Catherine kissed him, Clara squirming between them in protest at being squished, both of them laughing at their daughter's indignation. This was the life they'd built, not perfect, not without scars from battles fought, but genuinely theirs in every way that mattered. Years later, when Clara was old enough to ask questions, they told her the truth about the letters that brought her parents together, about the murder trial that nearly destroyed them before they began, about the courage it took to trust strangers and fight for justice when power demanded silence. They told her because they wanted her to understand that love wasn't just romance and happiness, but also choice and persistence and the willingness to stand beside someone when circumstances tried to tear you apart. Clara grew up knowing her parents had earned their happiness, that the ranch they worked and the life they'd built represented something more valuable than inherited wealth or easy comfort. The Dalton Ranch was sold eventually, divided among creditors and distant relatives who had no interest in ranching. Roland died in territorial prison before his appeals were exhausted, and with his death, the last shadow of that original conflict finally dissipated. New families moved in, working the land without the weight of Victor and Roland's crimes, and slowly the memory of that particular violence faded into local history. But Catherine and Daniel remembered privately, in quiet moments when they reflected on how easily their story could have ended differently, with him executed, with her returned to Boston defeated, with truth buried under convenient lies. Instead, they stood on their porch on warm summer evenings, watching Clara and the children who followed her, 2 sons and another daughter, a house full of noise and love and the particular chaos that came from raising people to be bold and questioning. Catherine never returned to Boston, though Rebecca visited twice over the years, marveling at her sister's transformation from constrained society lady to confident ranch woman. "You're happy," Rebecca said during her second visit, not quite a question, but seeking confirmation anyway. Catherine had looked at her life, the ranch flourishing, children healthy, Daniel beside her in partnership that deepened rather than diminished with time, and answered with absolute certainty, "Yes, more than I ever imagined possible." The story of the mail-order bride who'd saved her husband from hanging became local legend, told and retold until fact blurred with embellishment. But the truth was simpler and more profound than any legend could capture. 2 people had reached for each other across impossible distances, had fought for each other when circumstances demanded surrender, and had built something lasting from letters and trust and the revolutionary belief that love was worth defending even when the world said it was foolish. They'd chosen courage over certainty, partnership over comfort, truth over convenient lies. And in doing so, they'd created not just a marriage but a home, the kind that existed not in walls and roofs, but in the space between 2 people who kept choosing each other. Day after ordinary day, building a life that honored every word they'd written, every promise they'd made, every hope they'd carried across the distance that had once separated them, but now only measured how far they'd come together. The ranch still stands, generations later, worked by descendants who carry forward the legacy of stubbornness and courage that characterized their founders. And sometimes, in the quiet of early morning or the stillness of summer twilight, you can almost see them, a tall man and a determined woman standing together, looking out at the land they fought for, the life they built. The love they chose when choosing it required everything they had. They found what they were searching for in the most unlikely circumstances, and that finding changed not just their lives, but everyone who witnessed it, proving that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust a stranger's words enough to bet your entire future on them. And sometimes, miraculously, that bet pays off in ways that exceed every hope you brought with you on that long train journey west. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.